The night of February 8th, 1904. 11:30 p.m. Russian sailors stumble out of Port Arthur's bars, drunk and laughing. They've been mocking the Japanese all week, calling them little yellow monkeys who wouldn't dare challenge the mighty Russian fleet. On the flagship Petropavlovsk, officers are throwing a party. The band plays. Champagne flows. 650 meters away, invisible in the darkness, 10 Japanese destroyers cut their engines. Torpedoes slide into the water. In 4 hours, Japan will humiliate a European empire. A Russian officer will write, "A second later, the explosion occurred. Men were screaming." But here's what almost no one knows. This attack wasn't just a preview of Pearl Harbor. It was the opening shot of 3 wars that taught the world exactly how to die by the millions. Welcome to World War Zero. Every horror of 1914 through 18, the trenches, the machine guns, the millions dead, was tested here first. 3 wars. 3 laboratories of death. 3 warnings everyone ignored. War 1, 1904–05. Japan crushes Russia. 16,000 Japanese die in a single assault. A Buddhist monk walks the battlefield. Some had their heads torn off with only the skin attached. When burned, they looked like blackened rotten fish. Machine guns. Trenches. Industrial slaughter. The Western Front, 9 years early. War 2, 1911–12. Italy invades Libya. An Italian soldier writes home, "This is not real war." 6 days later, he's dead. Airplanes drop bombs for the first time in history. The future of warfare is born. And the Ottoman Empire's weakness is exposed. The Balkans are watching. War 3, October 1912. Actually, 2 wars. The Balkans explode twice. Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, Montenegro destroy the Ottoman Empire in Europe after 600 years. Then they turn on each other. Cholera sweeps the armies. A Turkish civilian watches refugees. The animal dread of cattle at the slaughterhouse. November 1912. Austria mobilizes 6 army corps. The Kaiser secretly promises Germany will back Austria if Russia moves. The Tsar's council draws up war plans. Europe is minutes from general war. They back down. This time, October 1913, the exact same crisis. Same ultimatum. Same pattern. They'll repeat it in July 1914. Except next time, no one backs down. Here's the terrifying part. Military observers from every major power watched these wars. They saw machine guns dominating battlefields, trenches becoming permanent, quick victories turning into bloody stalemates. And they convinced themselves their nation would be different. That morale could overcome machine guns. That war could still be won quickly. They were catastrophically wrong. Over the next 3 hours, you'll see exactly how we got here. You'll witness the most one-sided naval victory in history. 34 Russian ships destroyed versus 3 Japanese torpedo boats lost. You'll hear a Serbian medic watch a man bleed out. Blood dripped from the wagon onto the rails. You'll learn why the rage born in these wars led to the Armenian genocide. Because World War Zero wasn't about no one seeing the future. Everyone saw it coming. They just believed it would be different for them. It's February 8th, 1904. 11:45 p.m. A Russian officer on the Petropavlovsk hears water moving in the darkness. Then the explosion hits. This is World War Zero. This is where 50 million learned how to die. Let's watch the first domino fall. By the late 19th century, Japan had emerged as something the world had never seen before. An Asian nation that had transformed itself from feudal isolation into a modern industrial power in less than a single generation. For 250 years, Japan had sealed itself off from the outside world. The Tokugawa shogunate forbade foreign contact, executed Christian converts, and kept the country locked in deliberate stasis. Then, in 1853, American Commodore Matthew Perry sailed into Tokyo Bay with 4 warships and a simple message: open your ports or face bombardment. Japan opened, and what happened next shocked everyone. Under the Meiji Restoration that began in 1868, Japan didn't just modernize, it sprinted. The government tore down the feudal system, abolished the samurai class, and prioritized the wholesale adoption of Western science, industry, and military technology. British journalist George Rittner watched this transformation with amazement. In less than 20 years, Japan has acquired the knowledge it has taken us centuries to learn. The Japanese sent students to study in Europe and America. They hired foreign experts to build railroads, factories, and shipyards. They created a conscript army modelled on Prussia and a navy based on Britain's Royal Navy. Within a generation, Japan went from medieval to modern. And in 1894, Japan put its new military to the test. The First Sino-Japanese War lasted less than a year. Japanese forces crushed the Chinese military on land and at sea, seized Korea, Taiwan, and the Liaodong Peninsula, and forced China to pay massive reparations. The message was clear: Japan was now the strongest power in East Asia. But this new status immediately led to rivalry with the European great powers, especially Russia. After its humiliating defeat in the Crimean War during the 1850s, the Russian Empire had turned its attention eastward. If Russia couldn't expand in Europe, it would expand in Asia. The city of Vladivostok was founded in 1860. The name itself made Russian intentions crystal clear: ruler of the East. From 1894 onward, Tsar Nicholas II tried to increase Russian influence in Manchuria and Korea, despite opposition from some of his own ministers who thought the policy reckless. After the Sino-Japanese War, Russia and other European powers forced Japan to give up the strategic naval base at Port Arthur. Then Russia pressured China to lease that same base to them instead. The hypocrisy was blatant. The message was clear: European powers could take what they wanted, but Asian powers could not. Russian troops also participated in suppressing the Boxer Rebellion in China from 1900 to 1903. When the rebellion ended, other powers withdrew their forces. Russia stayed. 20,000 Russian soldiers remained in Manchuria, and the Tsar showed no intention of removing them. To Japanese leaders, the situation had become intolerable. In their eyes, Russia was threatening Korea and Japan itself. They called it a dagger pointed at the heart of Japan. If Russia dominated Korea, Japanese security would be permanently compromised. So, Japan went looking for allies, and found one in Great Britain. The British were worried about potential Russian expansion toward British India. They were also concerned about Russian ambitions in China and Persia. In 1902, Japan and the United Kingdom signed a formal alliance, a treaty of equals between an Asian and European power, something previously unthinkable. The terms were carefully crafted. If either nation went to war with a single power, the other would remain neutral but prevent additional countries from joining the conflict. If a second power entered the war, the ally would join the fight. This meant that in any Russo-Japanese conflict, the two empires would face each other one-on-one. The weak emperors of China and Korea, caught between two expanding empires, decided their best option was neutrality. Even if fighting broke out on their own soil, they would not intervene. By 1904, Russian and Japanese ambitions in the Far East had reached breaking point. Brief negotiations in late 1903 failed to resolve anything. Russia offered minor concessions while maintaining its military presence in Manchuria. Japan demanded Russian withdrawal. Neither side would budge. Japan began to prepare its new army and navy for war. What made this moment so significant wasn't just that two empires were about to fight. It was that, for the first time in the modern era, an Asian power was about to challenge a European empire as an equal. The world was watching, and no one, not the Russians, not the Europeans, not even many Japanese, truly believed Japan could win. They were about to be proven wrong. In 1904, Japan spent 82% of its entire national budget on the military. 82%. The army had grown to approximately 400,000 men. It was modelled on the Prussian General Staff system, which prioritized education, professional leadership, and high morale over aristocratic tradition. Japanese officers studied tactics, logistics, and strategy with the intensity of religious devotees. The government also worked to replace old clan loyalties with a new Japanese nationalism. The military code emphasized absolute loyalty to the emperor and the nation. The principal duty of soldiers is loyalty to sovereign and country. It is improbable that anyone born in this country will be wanting in patriotism. But for soldiers, this virtue is so essential that unless a man is strong in patriotism, he will be unfit for service. Then came the line that would define Japanese military culture for the next 4 decades. Remember always that duty is heavier than a mountain, while death is lighter than a feather. This wasn't rhetoric. Japanese soldiers were being trained to believe that dying for the emperor was not a tragedy but an honor. The Imperial Japanese Navy had become the 4th largest fleet in the world. It boasted 6 modern battleships and 6 battle cruisers, all state-of-the-art vessels built in British shipyards to British designs. Japanese officers had trained with the Royal Navy and adopted British tactics, signalling systems, and operational procedures. Britain also cooperated with Japan on intelligence. The Japanese built an effective network of informants throughout the Russian Far East, gathering information on troop movements, fortifications, and naval deployments. When the war began, Japan would know more about Russian positions than many Russian commanders. Meanwhile, Russia's military was stagnating. On paper, the Russian Empire had over 1 million men under arms. In reality, only about 150,000 were stationed in the Far East when the war began. The vast majority of Russian troops were poorly trained peasant conscripts with little motivation and less understanding of why they were fighting. The officer corps remained a product of aristocratic favoritism. Noble officers received commands based on family connections rather than competence. Non-noble officers were rare because the government considered them politically unreliable. Educated commoners might harbour revolutionary sympathies. Better to keep command in the hands of loyal aristocrats, even if they were incompetent. The situation in the navy was even worse. Many Russian sailors came from landlocked provinces and had never seen the ocean before joining the fleet. They complained that officers didn't even know their names, treating them as interchangeable peasants rather than trained seamen. Morale was abysmal. At Port Arthur and Vladivostok, Russia had 7 battleships and 11 cruisers. But these ships were of older design than the Japanese fleet, and many needed repairs that the limited Far Eastern shipyards couldn't provide. The strategic mathematics were brutal. Japan needed a short war. Its financial resources were limited, and it had taken loans from British and American banks just to modernize its military. A long conflict would bankrupt the country. Japan had to win decisive victories quickly and force Russia to accept a favorable peace before Japanese money ran out. Russia, on the other hand, had vast financial and manpower reserves. It could afford to lose battles and replace casualties indefinitely. The Trans-Siberian Railway, completed just 4 years earlier, could transport reinforcements from European Russia to the Far East, though the single-track line was slow and frequently broke down. If Russia could avoid total defeat long enough, its superior numbers would eventually overwhelm Japan. The Japanese High Command understood this perfectly. Their war plan was ruthlessly clear: cripple the Russian Pacific Fleet in a surprise attack, land troops in Korea, win decisive battles in Manchuria, capture Port Arthur, and force Russia to negotiate before the war bankrupted Japan. Everything depended on that first strike. By early February 1904, the Japanese combined fleet was ready. Admiral Togo Heihachiro had planned the attack on Port Arthur in minute detail. His officers had memorized the harbour layout, studied Russian patrol patterns, and rehearsed the torpedo runs dozens of times. The contrast between the two militaries couldn't have been starker. On one side, a highly motivated, professionally led, technologically modern force operating on borrowed money and borrowed time. On the other, a massive but poorly led, demoralized force that assumed its size alone would guarantee victory. One side was ready for modern war. The other was still fighting like it was 1850. The night of February 8th would reveal which approach would prevail. February 8th, 1904, the date Japan would change the world. At 11 p.m., the Japanese combined fleet arrived off Port Arthur under cover of darkness. Admiral Togo kept his capital ships at a safe distance, while 10 destroyers armed with torpedoes crept silently toward the Russian Pacific Fleet anchored outside the main harbour. The Russian fleet was not on high alert. Some torpedo nets had been laid, but many ships had not bothered. Numerous sailors were ashore, enjoying the bars and brothels of Port Arthur. On the flagship Petropavlovsk, officers were holding a party. Music played. Champagne flowed. No one expected an attack. The Japanese destroyers cut their engines and drifted the final distance on momentum, making almost no sound. At 11:30 p.m., the first 4 destroyers launched their torpedoes from 650 meters away. 6 torpedoes missed their targets. 2 found their marks. The cruisers Pallada and Retvizan shuddered as explosions tore into their hulls below the waterline. alarms began shrieking. Russian sailors scrambled from their bunks, many still drunk, trying to understand what was happening. A Russian sailor on the battleship Cesarevich recalled the moment. At 11:38 p.m., the commander heard the order, "Torpedo defense," in the cabin. To get dressed and get on deck was a matter of 2 minutes. During this, they opened fire. Barely on deck, the commander recognized 2 Japanese torpedo boats at the rear and a torpedo aiming at the ship from port. A second later, the explosion occurred. The Russians opened fire on the second group of Japanese destroyers, forcing them to launch their torpedoes from 1.5 kilometers away, much less accurate. But the damage was done. The Russian fleet was under attack, and they hadn't even known Japan had declared war. Admiral Togo now ordered his main fleet to close in and finish the job. His battleships began shelling the Russian positions, their heavy guns lighting up the night. But Russian coastal batteries quickly opened fire in response, and Togo realized his irreplaceable battleships were at risk. He ordered a withdrawal. When dawn broke on February 9th, the tactical result was mixed. No Japanese ships had been lost. Several Russian ships were damaged, but all could be repaired. The Russian Pacific Fleet was still largely intact. But psychologically, the attack achieved exactly what Admiral Togo intended. The Russians were shocked, humiliated, and frightened. They had been caught completely unprepared. Their intelligence had failed. Their readiness was exposed as inadequate. The Japanese had struck without warning, without a declaration of war, in a way that seemed dishonorable by European standards. Cautious Russian commanders, already demoralized, now ordered the Pacific Fleet to remain in Port Arthur's harbour and not risk another engagement. The ships stayed put, bottled up, effectively neutralized. This gave Japan complete freedom of action. With the Russian fleet contained, Japanese transports could land troops in Korea without fear of interdiction. The invasion could proceed exactly as planned. But before the attack on Port Arthur, Japan had already set another operation in motion. 3,000 Japanese troops had begun landing at Chemulpo, an international port in Korea. 2 Russian warships, the cruiser Varyag and the gunboat Koretz, watched from the harbour but couldn't legally intervene in neutral waters. On February 9th, as news of Port Arthur reached Chemulpo, the Japanese issued an ultimatum to the Russian ships: leave the harbour by noon or be destroyed. International law technically protected both sides in a neutral port, but Japan was past caring about technicalities. The Russian commanders faced an impossible choice. They could stay in harbour and be destroyed by overwhelming Japanese forces, or they could attempt to escape and be destroyed in open water. Either way, they were doomed. They chose to go down fighting. At 11:45 a.m., the Varyag and Koretz hoisted their battle flags, fired up their engines, and steamed toward the harbour entrance. British Captain Lewis Bailey watched from a nearby ship. Here were 694 Russian officers and men going to almost certain death, for no one expected them, or at any rate many of them, to survive the most unequal conflict, and yet they had their bands playing and were cheering, and their cheers were heartily returned by about 400 British officers and men, who felt very sorry for them and admired their pluck in giving battle. The waiting Japanese fleet opened fire. The battle was hopeless from the start. Japanese cruisers surrounded the 2 Russian ships and pounded them with shells. The Varyag fought back desperately, scoring several hits, but the outcome was never in doubt. After an hour, both Russian ships were wrecked. Rather than let them sink or be captured, the Russian commanders scuttled their vessels and evacuated the survivors to neutral ships in the harbor. Japan controlled the seas around Korea. The Russo-Japanese War had begun at sea. Russia had been humiliated twice in 24 hours. And the world was stunned. Japan, an Asian nation that most Europeans barely took seriously, had just bloodied the nose of a European great power. The implications would reverberate for decades. But these were just the opening moves. The focus of the war was about to shift to land, where hundreds of thousands of soldiers would clash in battles that previewed the industrial slaughter of 1914. The first of those battles was about to begin along the Yalu River. The Japanese First Army landed 42,000 men in Korea and began moving north toward Manchuria. Their objective: push back the 19,000 men of the Russian Eastern Detachment along the Yalu and Ai rivers, then land additional forces at Dalny to cut off Port Arthur from the landward side. The first clashes pitted Russian Cossacks against Japanese advance units in freezing winter conditions. Despite the Cossacks' fierce reputation as horsemen and raiders, Japanese officers were unimpressed. Military translator Usa Ogihiko wrote dismissively, "The Cossack army is an army in name only. In fact, they are nothing more than trick riders. There are several 100,000 Cossacks, but if all of them were to come together, what would they be able to do? They are useless soldiers in a war." The Yalu River should have been a strong defensive position. It was fast-flowing, difficult to cross, and offered clear fields of fire. But the Russian chain of command was a disaster. General Mikhail Zasulich, commanding the Eastern Detachment, received contradictory orders from his superiors. Minister of War Alexei Kuropatkin told him to retreat if attacked. Viceroy Yevgeny Alexeyev, the Tsar's favorite uncle, told him to stand firm. Zasulich chose to stand and fight, but his confusion about strategic objectives would plague the entire battle. The Japanese, meanwhile, were showcasing tactics that would become standard in modern warfare. They dug artillery pits to hide their guns from observation. They sent scouts disguised as Korean fishermen to reconnoiter Russian positions. While the Russians moved around openly and left their large artillery carriages uncamouflaged, the Japanese concealed everything. Japanese engineers even built a large bridge across the Yalu in plain sight of Russian positions. The Russians obligingly opened fire, revealing their gun positions. Japanese counter-battery fire, from hidden positions, then systematically knocked out the Russian artillery before the main infantry assault even began. Zasulich expected the Japanese to attack near the wide, shallow mouth of the river within range of Japanese naval gunfire support. Instead, the Japanese used a flanking tactic that would become their signature move throughout the war. The 12th Division crossed the Yalu quite some distance from the Russian flank, in a sector Zasulich thought was too difficult to traverse. He assumed it was a feint and held his position. This allowed the 12th Division to capture the high ground and cross the Ai River after fierce close-quarters fighting. Japanese Captain Takemean recalled the assault. The fierce battle lasted 3 hours, and all of those who fell were killed or wounded when crossing the Ai River. It is said that the soldiers, standing in the midst of the smoke and bullets, were in high spirits, and with a vigor that could never be seen in ordinary training, they chanted military songs in one voice and kept pace as they advanced. All is as it should be. The image is striking. Japanese soldiers singing in unison while charging through a hail of bullets. This was the Japanese military culture in action. Discipline and morale held even under extreme stress. With the Russian left flank collapsing, on May 1st, the Japanese launched a general assault in the center across the Yalu. They drove the Russians from their trenches. Japanese artillery on the heights poured fire onto retreating Russian columns. Russian forces fell back into the gorges behind the river, which could have been another defensible position if the command situation wasn't in chaos. But with contradictory orders and no clear plan, Russian units began surrendering rather than fighting in isolated pockets. The Battle of the Yalu River cost approximately 2,000 Russian and 900 Japanese lives. Most Russian forces managed to escape, but they had lost their most important positions in Manchuria. The Japanese landings at Dalny proceeded as planned, and it seemed the war was going decisively in Japan's favor. Foreign banks, watching Japan's string of victories, began extending credit. Money started flowing into Japanese coffers, desperately needed money to continue the war. But the Yalu also revealed the face of modern warfare. This wasn't the warfare of Napoleon or the American Civil War. This was something new. Artillery dominated the battlefield, forcing infantry to dig in or die. Flanking maneuvers mattered more than frontal assaults. Concealment and deception were as important as firepower. Intelligence gathering could determine victory before the first shot was fired. And casualties were mounting at a scale that shocked observers. 900 Japanese dead in a single battle was considered light, a sign of how deadly modern weapons had become. Soldiers who just a generation earlier would have fought with swords and muskets were now facing magazine-fed rifles, machine guns, and quick-firing artillery. The killing power of industrial-age weapons was orders of magnitude greater than anything that came before. But tactical thinking hadn't caught up. Commanders still believed in massed infantry charges, in the power of morale over firepower, in decisive cavalry actions. The Japanese were learning fast. They adapted their tactics, used terrain intelligently, and coordinated infantry and artillery effectively. But even they were shocked by the casualty rates. The Russians, on the other hand, seemed to learn nothing. Their command structure remained dysfunctional. Their tactics remained outdated. Their officers continued to blame subordinates rather than examining their own failures. After the Yalu, the Japanese were positioned to move on Port Arthur from the landward side. And that siege would become a preview of the Western Front, a grinding, brutal, months-long battle of attrition where modern defensive weapons proved almost impossible to overcome. But before Port Arthur fell, the war at sea would take another dramatic turn. The arrival of Admiral Stepan Makarov would give the Russians brief hope that the Pacific Fleet might break out and change the course of the war. That hope would be crushed in the most tragic way possible. After the Japanese victory at the Yalu, they were positioned to attack Port Arthur from both land and sea. The Russian Pacific Fleet remained bottled up in the harbour, neutralised by the shock of the February attack and by Admiral Togo's blockading squadron offshore. But in April 1904, the arrival of Admiral Stepan Makarov changed everything. Makarov was different from other Russian commanders. He was energetic, innovative, and aggressive. He immediately began leading sorties against the Japanese blockade, trying to draw out Togo's battleships and engage them in a decisive action. His boldness raised Russian morale and worried the Japanese. For a few weeks, it seemed like Russia might actually contest control of the seas. Then, on April 13th, disaster struck. The flagship Petropavlovsk, the same ship where officers had partied the night of the Japanese attack, hit a Japanese mine just outside Port Arthur Harbour. The explosion detonated the ship's forward magazine. The Petropavlovsk sank in less than 2 minutes. Admiral Makarov went down with his ship. 635 sailors died with him. Also killed was the famous Russian war artist Vasily Vereshchagin, who had been painting scenes of the conflict. Russian hopes sank with the Petropavlovsk. With Makarov dead, the Pacific Fleet retreated back into its defensive posture, and Togo's blockade tightened. Meanwhile, the Japanese Third Army, which had landed at Dalny, began moving up to besiege Port Arthur from the landward side. General Nogi Maresuke commanded the assault force. He had captured Port Arthur in just 1 day during the Sino-Japanese War 10 years earlier. He expected similar success. He was catastrophically wrong. In 1904, Port Arthur was no longer a Chinese garrison with outdated defences. The Russians had spent years and millions of rubles turning it into a modern fortress. Concrete fortifications, interlocking fields of fire, extensive barbed wire networks, machine gun positions, hand grenades, everything the latest military technology could provide for defense. The Russian garrison inflicted horrific losses on the first Japanese assaults. Nogi, desperate for a quick victory, ordered Nikudan Kogeki, human bullet attacks. These were essentially suicidal waves of infantry charging directly into machine gun fire and artillery bombardment. In a single assault, the Japanese lost 16,000 men. 16,000. Buddhist chaplain Mamiya Eiju walked the battlefield afterward and tried to describe what he saw. Some of them were missing half of their bodies. Some had 1 arm and 1 leg removed. Some had their heads torn off with only the skin attached, and some had their shoes filled with the flesh of their feet and were abandoned. When burned, they looked like blackened, rotten fish, and you couldn't know whose son or husband they once were. No illustration of the Buddhist hells has ever portrayed such cruelties. The Japanese government, desperate to maintain public support, hid the scale of the losses. Newspapers reported glorious victories, while censors blocked any mention of the casualty figures. Families received vague notifications that their sons or husbands had died heroically for the emperor, with no details about how or where. The siege of Port Arthur turned into a grinding, months-long nightmare. Japanese forces dug trenches, just as they would 10 years later in France. They tunneled under Russian fortifications. They brought up heavy artillery to shell the defences. The Russians fought back with everything they had. This was modern warfare in its purest form. Defensive technology, concrete, barbed wire, machine guns, quick-firing artillery, had outpaced offensive capabilities. Attackers died by the thousands, while defenders, protected by their fortifications, survived to keep fighting. The siege lasted from August through December 1904. More than 59,000 Japanese soldiers died taking Port Arthur. Russian casualties were also severe, though lower than Japanese losses. But Japan couldn't afford to leave Port Arthur untaken. As long as the Russian Pacific Fleet remained intact in the harbour, it posed a threat to Japanese supply lines. And more importantly, the Russian Baltic Fleet was on its way. In October 1904, the Baltic Fleet had departed from European Russia on an 8-month journey halfway around the world. It had been renamed the Second Pacific Fleet and ordered to sail to the Far East, relieve Port Arthur, and destroy the Japanese Navy. If the Baltic Fleet arrived before Port Arthur fell, Japan would face a much stronger Russian naval force. potentially strong enough to cut off Japanese armies in Manchuria. The race was on. Could Japan take Port Arthur before the Baltic Fleet arrived? The answer came in January 1905. After months of horrific fighting, after suicidal charges and endless shelling, Japanese forces finally captured the high ground overlooking the harbour. From there, their artillery could fire directly down onto the Russian ships. Unable to defend against plunging fire from above, the Russian Pacific Fleet was systematically destroyed at anchor. One by one, Japanese shells sank the battleships and cruisers that had been bottled up for months. On January 2nd, 1905, the Russian commander at Port Arthur surrendered. 59,000 Japanese dead to capture a single fortified city. The Japanese people were shocked when the real casualty figures eventually leaked out. But the strategic objective had been achieved. The Pacific Fleet was gone. Port Arthur was in Japanese hands. And now 5 Japanese armies could converge for the decisive land battle they had been planning since the war began. That battle would be fought at Mukden, and it would be the largest battle in history up to that point. Throughout the summer and fall of 1904, a series of battles gradually drove Russian forces away from Port Arthur toward defensive positions around the Manchurian town of Mukden. With Port Arthur fallen in January 1905, 5 Japanese armies could now converge for the decisive battle their general staff had envisioned. But Japan's string of victories had come at a horrific price. Casualties were mounting beyond anything Japan could sustain. Russia, on the other hand, had seemingly unlimited reserves. Fresh troops continued arriving via the Trans-Siberian Railway, slowly but steadily replacing losses. Time was on Russia's side. Japanese commander General Oyama Iwao knew the Russians were planning a counterattack. Rather than wait, he decided to strike first at Mukden. This would be Japan's attempt at a knockout blow, one massive battle to destroy Russian military power in Manchuria and force the Tsar to negotiate. The forces gathering around Mukden were staggering. Japan concentrated 200,000 men, 7,300 cavalry, and 1,000 artillery pieces. 3 Russian armies fielded approximately 275,000 men, 16,000 cavalry, and 1,200 artillery pieces. However, the Japanese had about twice as many machine guns as the Russians, a technological edge that would prove critical. Oyama planned yet another flanking maneuver. His strategy: pin the Russian center with artillery while swinging forces around both flanks in a massive pincer movement. This time, the Russians wouldn't escape. On February 17, 1905, the Japanese army of the Yalu began moving through the hills of the Russian eastern flank. A strong artillery barrage pinned the Russian center in place. General Kuropatkin, commanding Russian forces, assumed the main Japanese thrust was coming in the east. He shifted units across the 100-kilometer-long front, which weakened his western flank. And that's exactly where General Nogi's Third Army launched its primary assault. Nogi swung around Mukden from the west, threatening the Russians' lines of retreat northward. If he could cut the railroad, the entire Russian army might be trapped. The prize was enormous, but so was the risk. Nogi's forces were operating at the extreme end of their supply lines. German military observer Captain von Beckmann recorded the new face of warfare at Mukden. The Russian fire was silenced, but broke out again whenever the machine gun fire slackened. The Japanese infantry used these pauses in the enemy's fire to press forward to close range under cover of their own machine gun fire. This was combined arms warfare in its early form. Machine guns suppressed enemy positions. Infantry advanced during the suppression. Artillery provided distant support. The coordination required was unprecedented. But the coordination on the Russian side was collapsing. As Nogi's forces threatened their retreat, Russian troops began to panic. Officers tried to organize counterattacks, but the chaos turned into a rout. Fleeing Russian soldiers burned supplies to keep them from Japanese hands and looted vodka stores. Discipline evaporated. Colonel Anton Denikin, who would later lead the White Forces in the Russian Civil War, witnessed the disaster. Individual soldiers, sometimes in small groups, then scattering again, helplessly looked for a way out of the trap. The whole field, as far as the eye could see, was littered with abandoned boxes and heaps of luggage, even from the commander-in-chief's baggage train. Wagons and carts, ambulances, and riderless horses all rushed about in different directions. For the first time in the war, I saw panic. The scene repeated across history, first as tragedy in 1905, then as farce, when Denikin himself would experience similar defeats against the Bolsheviks in 1919 and 1920. Despite the disaster unfolding, General Kuropatkin managed to put together a rearguard to prevent total annihilation. The fighting had been brutal, and the Japanese were once again too exhausted to pursue effectively. Most of the Russian army escaped northward, though badly mauled. The Battle of Mukden was a Japanese victory, but not the decisive knockout blow Oyama had hoped for. Japanese casualties were approximately 25%, unsustainable in the long run. Russia had lost more men in absolute numbers, but it could replace them. Japan could not. Mukden was likely the largest battle in history up to that point in terms of troop numbers engaged and ammunition expended. The Japanese fired as much artillery ammunition at Mukden as the entire German army had used during the 6-month Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871. The Russians used even more. The sheer scale of industrial warfare was becoming clear. Modern armies could fire millions of shells in weeks. They could suffer tens of thousands of casualties in days. Battles could stretch across fronts, measuring hundreds of kilometers. The logistics of feeding, supplying, and moving such enormous forces strained the capabilities of even major powers. And there was an often overlooked human element to the Battle of Mukden that would have consequences 9 years later. Among the Russian commanders at Mukden were Generals Alexander Samsonov and Pavel Rennenkampf. The two men developed such bitter hatred for each other during the campaign that they nearly came to blows. Samsonov blamed Rennenkampf for failing to support his positions. Rennenkampf accused Samsonov of incompetence. Their feud became an open scandal in the Russian army. Watching this dysfunction carefully was a German military observer named Max Hoffmann. He took meticulous notes on the Russo-Japanese War, including detailed observations about the Samsonov-Rennenkampf feud. 9 years later, in August 1914, those same two generals would command the Russian First and Second Armies invading East Prussia. They would still hate each other. They would still refuse to coordinate. And Max Hoffmann, by then a senior operations officer with the German Eighth Army, would exploit their hatred to help destroy both Russian armies at the Battle of Tannenberg. 92,000 Russians captured. 50,000 dead. One of Germany's greatest victories in World War I, made possible in part by lessons learned at Mukden in 1905. The lessons of World War I, weaponized. But in February 1905, the Russo-Japanese War wasn't over yet. The Japanese had won on land, but they were exhausted and nearly bankrupt. Everything now depended on the navy. The Russian Baltic Fleet was still making its way across the globe. When it arrived, one final battle would decide the war. And that battle would be the most one-sided naval victory in modern history. The voyage of the Russian Baltic Fleet was an 8-month nightmare. Renamed the Second Pacific Fleet, it departed from European Russia in October 1904 under the command of Admiral Zinovy Rozhistvensky, a man whose officers nicknamed Mad Dog for his volcanic temper. The fleet had to sail 29,000 kilometers around Africa because Britain, Japan's ally, denied them use of the Suez Canal. The journey became a catalogue of disasters. In the North Sea, Russian sailors mistook British fishing trawlers for Japanese torpedo boats and opened fire, sinking several boats and killing British fishermen. The incident nearly triggered war between Russia and Britain. Only Russia's profuse apologies and promise of compensation prevented a diplomatic catastrophe that would have ended the war instantly. The fleet's mechanical problems were endless. Ships broke down constantly. The single expansion engines of the older vessels couldn't match the pace of modern warships. Refueling in neutral ports became a logistical nightmare because most countries wanted nothing to do with the Russians. The fleet had to coal at sea from German supply ships, a dangerous and exhausting process. Morale disintegrated. Sailors mutinied. Officers fought. Disease spread. Admiral Rozhistvensky himself referred to some of his older ships as self-sinkers, vessels so decrepit he expected them to simply break apart and sink without enemy action. By the time the Baltic Fleet finally reached Far Eastern waters in May 1905, it was in no condition to fight. But the Tsar's orders were clear: proceed to Vladivostok and destroy the Japanese navy. Admiral Togo knew they were coming. Japanese intelligence had tracked the Baltic Fleet's progress for months. Togo had used the time to repair his ships, train his crews, and prepare meticulously for the decisive engagement. He knew the Russians would have to pass through the Tsushima Strait, a 50-kilometer wide passage between Korea and Japan, on their way to Vladivostok. The Japanese combined fleet waited like a trap, ready to spring. Togo's plan was simple but risky. Torpedo boats would harass the Russians at night. At dawn, the main Japanese fleet would intercept and destroy them in a decisive engagement. Everything depended on finding the Russians in time and executing the attack flawlessly. On the morning of May 27, 1905, Japanese scouts sighted the Russian fleet. The weather was overcast with poor visibility, bad conditions for a naval battle. The sea was too rough for effective torpedo boat attacks, so Togo would have to commit his entire battle fleet in a daylight action. That afternoon, the two fleets sighted each other. The Japanese fleet centered on 4 modern battleships, 8 armored cruisers, and 4 protected cruisers, plus numerous smaller vessels. The Russian force was led by 8 battleships and 10 cruisers, but many were older designs, and the fleet was strung out over several kilometers, lacking cohesion. For Admiral Akiyama Sanyuki, the Japanese operations officer, this was the culmination of everything he had worked toward. The Navy had been built up through many years of painstaking work, but it all came to a head in a mere 30-minute maneuver. The decade I spent training in tactics and strategy was also all for the sake of those 30 minutes. It could not have happened without a decade of preparation, so we could think of it as a decade-long war. Togo ordered his fleet to cross in front of the Russian line, crossing the T in naval terminology. This classic maneuver would allow all Japanese guns to bear on the leading Russian ships, while the Russians could only fire from their forward turrets. But executing the turn meant briefly exposing his flagship to concentrated enemy fire. The Japanese ships steamed obliquely toward the leading Russian vessels and began their turn. Both sides opened fire. The Russians had heavier guns, 12-inch main batteries that could punch through armor. Japanese shells immediately began hitting the Mikasa, Togo's flagship. It seemed the gamble might fail. But the Japanese had crucial advantages. Their rate of fire was faster. Japanese gun crews could load and fire nearly twice as fast as Russian crews. Japanese fire control was superior, with better range-finding equipment and more practice. And the geometry of the battle meant Japanese ships could fire full broadsides, while Russians could only use their forward guns. The effect was devastating. Admiral Rozesvensky later described what happened to his ships. The paint burnt with a clear flame on the steel surfaces. Boats, ropes, hammocks, and woodwork caught fire. Cartridges in the ready racks ignited. Upper works and light guns were swept away. Turrets jammed. Within the first hour, the Russian flagship Suvorov was hit repeatedly, and Rozestvensky was wounded. The ship lost steering control and fell out of formation. Shortly afterward, Japanese shells sank the battleship Ozlyabya, the first modern armoured warship ever sunk by gunfire alone. A Russian sailor on a nearby destroyer watched his comrades abandon the sinking Ozlyabya. The whole of the starboard side, as far as the keel was laid bare, her bright plating looked like the wet scales of some sea monster, and suddenly, as if by command, all the men who had crowded to the starboard side jumped down upon these scales. Most of them were dashed against the bilge keel and fell crippled into the sea. In the water they formed an unimaginable mass, and the enemy's shell never ceased the whole time from bursting over them. A few more seconds, and the Ozlyabya disappeared beneath the water. The battleship Alexander III made a desperate charge at the Japanese line, with all guns blazing, trying to disrupt their formation and buy time for other Russian ships. The suicidal attack brought temporary relief, but the outcome was already decided. At 7 p.m., the battle resumed after a brief pause. Damaged Russian ships were easy prey for Japanese gunners. The Japanese sank the Alexander III, then the battleship Borodino. As darkness fell, Togo sent in his torpedo boats. All through the night, Japanese destroyers hunted the remnants of the Russian fleet. Torpedoes smashed into crippled ships. Survivors in the water screamed for help that wouldn't come. By dawn, the Baltic fleet had effectively ceased to exist. The next morning, only 2 Russian battleships remained afloat, surrounded by Japanese forces, with no hope of reaching Vladivostok. The Russian commanders surrendered. The final tally was staggering. 34 of 38 Russian ships were sunk, captured, or interned in neutral ports. All 8 Russian battleships were gone. Approximately 5,000 Russian sailors were killed. Japanese losses: 3 torpedo boats. 110 dead. The Battle of Tsushima was the most one-sided naval victory in modern history. Not since Trafalgar, in 1805, had one fleet so completely destroyed another. And unlike Trafalgar, Tsushima was fought with modern armoured warships, long-range guns, and steel shells, the technology of the industrial age. The Russian navy was finished. The Tsar had no choice but to negotiate. Japan had won the war. But victory came at a price that would haunt Japan for decades. The war had cost over 80,000 Japanese lives. The country was functionally bankrupt, and the peace terms Japan would receive wouldn't nearly compensate for what the war had cost. The question now was, could Japan win at the negotiating table what it had won on the battlefield? The United States mediated peace talks in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, in the summer of 1905. President Theodore Roosevelt personally involved himself in the negotiations, seeing an opportunity to establish America as a major diplomatic player on the world stage. Both belligerents desperately needed to end the war. Japan was victorious, but militarily exhausted and financially bankrupt. The string of victories had cost over 80,000 Japanese lives and emptied the treasury. Foreign loans had kept the war effort going, but those loans were coming due. Japan needed peace before its economy collapsed. Russia faced revolutionary unrest at home. The defeats in Manchuria had emboldened opposition movements. Strikes were spreading. The 1905 revolution was beginning, and the Tsar couldn't afford to keep fighting while his own country burned. But both sides also tried to maintain negotiating leverage through military pressure. In July, Japanese troops occupied Sakhalin Island to pressure the Russians. The Russians, meanwhile, sent fresh divisions to Manchuria to show they could continue the war if needed. The negotiations were tense. Japan demanded territorial concessions, control of Korea, and a massive war indemnity. Russia was willing to give up territory, but absolutely refused to pay money to Japan. The talks nearly collapsed several times. Finally, on September 5, 1905, the Treaty of Portsmouth was signed. The terms: Russia would withdraw from Manchuria and the Liaodong Peninsula, granting Japan control of Port Arthur and the South Manchurian Railway. Russia would recognize Japanese dominance over nominally independent Korea. The southern half of Sakhalin Island would remain Japanese. But critically, Russia refused to pay a war indemnity. Not a single ruble would go to Japan to compensate for the war's costs. President Roosevelt received the Nobel Peace Prize for his mediation efforts. The citation referred to Japan as one of the world's great powers, a recognition that would have been unthinkable just 5 years earlier. In Japan, the public reaction was shock and rage. The government had censored news of the horrific casualties throughout the war. The Japanese people thought their nation had won a glorious, relatively easy victory. Now they learned the truth. Japan was bankrupt, tens of thousands were dead, and Russia wasn't even paying compensation. Riots broke out in Tokyo. Angry mobs attacked government buildings and police stations. Martial law was declared. The Japanese public felt betrayed. They had made enormous sacrifices for a peace treaty that seemed to give them almost nothing. But the public didn't know how tenuous Japan's position had actually become. The country was days away from defaulting on its foreign loans. The military was exhausted. Another few months of war might have led to complete economic collapse. The treaty, unsatisfying as it was, saved Japan from potential disaster. In Russia, the treaty was less controversial, but the defeat had profound consequences. Opposition to the Tsar's autocratic regime strengthened dramatically. The 1905 revolution forced him to grant a constitution and create an elected Duma, Russia's first parliament. The defeat exposed the rot in the Tsarist system and set Russia on the path to 1917. The global impact was enormous. Japan had become the first Asian nation to defeat a European great power in the modern era. Colonized peoples around the world took notice. If Japan could challenge European dominance, perhaps others could too. Indian nationalists, Chinese reformers, and Vietnamese anti-colonialists all drew inspiration from Japan's victory. Western military observers filed detailed reports on what they had witnessed: the destructive power of machine guns, the dominance of defensive fortifications, the importance of artillery, the horrific casualty rates of modern warfare. All the lessons were there, clearly documented. And almost all of them learned exactly the wrong lessons. They saw that modern weapons were deadly, but concluded that superior morale and offensive spirit could overcome firepower. They saw that frontal assaults were suicidal, but decided that better training and bolder tactics would make them work. They saw that defensive technology had outpaced offensive capabilities, but convinced themselves their armies would be different. The casualty figures from the Russo-Japanese War were clear. Approximately 50,000 Russian soldiers and 80,000 Japanese soldiers died. Hundreds of thousands more were wounded. This was industrial-scale slaughter using the latest military technology. 9 years later, Europe would apply those same weapons on a much larger scale. Instead of hundreds of thousands dead, there would be millions. Instead of battles lasting weeks, battles would last months. Instead of fronts measuring hundreds of kilometers, fronts would stretch across continents. The Russo-Japanese War was the preview. World War I would be the main event. The first domino had fallen. The second was about to tip. Italian unification in 1871 left the new kingdom incomplete in the eyes of many nationalists. The Risorgimento had created a united Italy, but New Italy, the Italia Nuova movement, dreamed of something far grander: the reconstitution of the Roman Empire through imperial expansion in the Mediterranean. The dream collided with reality. While Italian nationalists fantasized about Mare Nostrum, RC, Britain and France, were actually carving up the Mediterranean world. In 1882, France took control of Tunisia, an area that many Italians considered their natural sphere of influence. Italian immigrants had settled there, Italian businesses had invested there, and Italian strategists had assumed it would eventually become Italian territory. The French takeover felt like theft. Italian newspapers raged. Nationalist politicians demanded action. But Italy was too weak to challenge France, so the rage turned inward into bitter resentment. That same period, Britain occupied Egypt. The two great prizes of North Africa, the two territories closest to Italy, had been snatched by other powers. Italy was left out of the Mediterranean scramble entirely. By 1911, imperial competition in the Mediterranean remained fierce. The Moroccan crisis that summer nearly triggered war between France and Germany. The message was clear: the scramble for colonies was far from over. This left Ottoman Libya, the provinces of Tripolitania, Cyrenaica, and Fezzan, as Italy's last viable target in North Africa. And Italian leaders worried constantly that France or Britain might seize it first. Italy had been expanding its soft power in Libya for years. Italian banks opened branches in Tripoli. Italian schools educated local children. Italian hospitals treated the sick. This economic and cultural penetration was meant to prepare the ground for eventual annexation. But some Italian diplomats pushed for immediate military action. Tommaso Titoni argued, Tripolitania is necessary to Italy for the Mediterranean balance. We could wait if there were not the danger that we might lose it. Today, this danger begins to take shape. Thus, the occupation of Tripolitania imposes itself upon us as an unavoidable necessity. The Ottomans knew about Italian ambitions and tried to forestall invasion through concessions. They granted Italy economic privileges, railway rights, and favourable trade terms. But these offers couldn't hide the empire's fundamental weakness. The Ottoman Empire in 1911 was crumbling. Decades of economic decline had left the treasury empty. The Young Turk Revolution of 1908 had brought political chaos. A failed counter-coup by the Sultan in 1909 had deepened divisions. The government in Constantinople was weak, divided, and vulnerable. Ottoman minister to Rome, Saifuddin Bey, understood that concessions wouldn't satisfy Italy. The concessions that we make to the Italians in our African provinces will do nothing but increase their appetite and offer them occasion to intervene. Italian appetite is not satiable. He was right. Italy was determined to take Libya, and no amount of Ottoman generosity would change that. Italian leaders felt the window of opportunity closing. France and Britain were consolidating their North African empires. Germany wanted a strong Ottoman ally. Austria-Hungary worried about Balkan stability. If Italy waited much longer, the great powers might force them to back down. Prime Minister Giovanni Giolitti admitted his anxiety. The nationalists imagine that Tripoli is the territory of a poor black simpleton whom a European state can dethrone as he wishes. But Tripoli is a province of the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottoman Empire is a great European power. Despite his caution, the pressure to act was overwhelming. In late September 1911, Italy made its decision. The die was cast. The Italian government launched a public relations offensive in 1911 to manufacture support for war. The press published stories of Ottoman insults to Italian commercial interests in Libya. Italian citizens supposedly faced harassment. Italian businesses allegedly suffered from Ottoman bias. Most of these stories were grossly exaggerated or entirely fabricated, but they served their purpose, turning public opinion toward war. Prime Minister Giolitti and Foreign Minister Antonio di San Giuliano carefully managed both domestic politics and international diplomacy. They needed nationalist support at home while avoiding great power opposition abroad. Italy's allies in the Triple Alliance, Germany and Austria-Hungary, were actually opposed to weakening the Ottoman Empire. Germany wanted the Ottomans strong as a counterweight to British and French power. Austria-Hungary desperately wanted stability in the Balkans. If the Ottomans collapsed, the entire Balkan region might explode. So Italy couldn't count on its official allies. Instead, Giolitti struck a deal with France. The agreement was simple. France wouldn't interfere with Italy in Libya, and Italy wouldn't interfere with France in Tunisia and Morocco. Meanwhile, the Ottomans were making the situation worse for themselves. They had moved troops away from Libya to deal with a rebellion in Yemen. This left Libya weakly defended. The Ottomans did bring in weapons to arm the local population, but they had no concrete plan for defending their North African territories against a modern European military. On September 27, 1911, Italy delivered an ultimatum to the Ottoman government. The demand: agree to Italian occupation of Libya within 24 hours or face military action. 24 hours. To surrender an entire province. The ultimatum was designed to be rejected. The Ottomans offered further economic concessions. But the Italian government had already decided on war and rejected these offers without serious consideration. The ultimatum expired on September 28th. Italy and the Ottoman Empire were now at war. Giolitti issued a statement that tried to sound reluctant. The Italian government, therefore, finding itself forced to safeguard its dignity and its interests, has decided to proceed to the military occupation of Tripoli and Cyrenaica. The phrasing suggested Italy had been left with no choice. In reality, Italy had manufactured the crisis from the beginning. The Italian military now had to arrange an invasion on extremely short notice. Most officers weren't fully aware of government plans until September. There was no detailed operational plan. Maps of the interior were scarce and outdated. Some planning documents even referenced ancient Roman sources like Julius Caesar for topographic information. This stunning lack of preparation reflected the colonial mindset, the assumption that taking territory from a lesser power would be easy. The Italians expected quick victory. They were about to discover that colonial wars were no longer quick or glorious. Between October 3rd and October 21st, 1911, 25,000 Italian troops landed along the Libyan coast. They captured Tripoli, Tobruk, Benghazi, Berna, and Homs in rapid succession. Ottoman resistance was generally light because the defenders were badly outnumbered and outgunned. The landings appeared to confirm Italian assumptions that this would be an easy war. Italian soldier Innocenzo Bianchi wrote home with confidence, "I believe that it is not real war, but little attacks, and soon we shall overcome. Overall, I'm very happy, and you'll see that it will be finished very soon." 6 days later, Bianchi was killed in action. His death symbolized Italy's fundamental miscalculation. The Italians assumed that by seizing the coastal towns, they could force the Ottomans to surrender Libya. This was classic 19th century colonial thinking. But the Ottomans didn't surrender. They simply withdrew in good order beyond the range of Italian naval guns. Ottoman regular troops fell back into the desert interior, maintaining unit cohesion. The Italian planning disaster now became apparent. Military planners knew so little about the Libyan interior that some documents relied on ancient Roman sources for geographic information. They had assumed the war would be won on the coast. They had assumed wrong. More critically, the Italians made a catastrophic assumption about the local Arab population. Italian propaganda had portrayed the Arabs as victims of Ottoman oppression who would welcome Italian liberation. The reality was exactly opposite. The local Arab population, particularly the Senussi Sufi order, had no interest in exchanging Ottoman rule for Italian colonization. They saw both as foreign occupiers. But at least the Ottomans were fellow Muslims. The Italians were Christian invaders with clear colonial ambitions. By late October 1911, the Ottomans and Arabs were making common cause. The Italian military position was strong in some ways. Italian conscripts brought modern equipment, grey-green uniforms, Modello 91 magazine rifles, Maxim machine guns, and German-built Krupp artillery. Most importantly, Italian warships offshore provided heavy naval gunfire support. But estimates of opposing forces revealed the challenge Italy faced. There were probably between 2,500 and 5,000 Ottoman regular troops. More significantly, 20,000 to 35,000 Arab tribesmen were now fighting alongside the Ottomans under Senussi sheikhs. The Arab fighters knew the desert intimately. They could operate far from supply lines. They could appear and disappear into the landscape. This was their home terrain. The Ottoman Model 1893 Mauser rifle was actually considered superior to the Italian weapon because of its larger caliber. British Dr. Ernest Griffin, serving with the Turkish Red Crescent, explained, "The injuries produced by the small 6.5mm conical bullets used by the Italians were scarcely ever severe, and if the wounds had not been infected, we had the satisfaction of soon sending our Arab patients back to their duties in the field." The larger Mauser rounds caused devastating wounds. Italian soldiers discovered that even minor hits could be fatal. Ottoman forces identified a weakness in the Italian fortified line near Tripoli. Italian trenches ran directly through an oasis, providing cover for attackers. Additionally, the Italians hadn't built strong fortifications around the settlement of Shahr al-Shat. A target had been identified, and on October 23rd, Ottoman and Arab forces would exploit that weakness. October 23rd, 1911, 7 a.m. Around 1,800 men of the Italian 11th Bersaglieri Regiment were awakened by the sound of gunfire and dogs barking. Ottoman forces, supported by Arab fighters, attacked a 6-kilometer stretch of front between Fort Sidi Mesri and the sea. The Italians scrambled to man their positions, many still half asleep. Then the situation became much worse. Local Arabs emerged from the settlement of Shahr al-Shat, supposedly pacified territory behind Italian lines, and attacked the Italians from behind. It was a two-front battle that the Italians were completely unprepared for. Italian soldier Evangelista Salvatore recalled the shock. "The Saraceni seemed to rise out of the earth on every side of us." Enemies appeared from directions the Italians had thought secure. Units lost communication with each other. Officers couldn't determine where attacks were coming from. Panic began to spread. Italian reinforcements eventually arrived and gradually beat back the Ottoman and Arab fighters. By midday, Italian forces had re-established control. Tactically, the Italians could claim they had held their ground. But the casualties told a different story. At least 21 Italian officers and 482 enlisted men were killed. More horrifying, 250 Italians were massacred in a cemetery after they had surrendered. When Italian forces retook the area, they found mutilated bodies. The official Italian General Staff tried to downplay the disaster. "Our losses were not light, but justified by the result, and showed that the morale of our troops was excellent." Classic military spin. The reality was that Shahr al-Shat had been a psychological catastrophe. The Italian response on the ground was swift and brutal. Over the following days, Italian forces executed approximately 4,000 Arabs by firing squad. Entire villages were destroyed. The executions were collective punishment, killing Arabs regardless of whether they had participated in the attack. The massacres achieved nothing except to guarantee that Arab resistance would intensify. Every execution created new enemies. Every destroyed village sent survivors fleeing to join the resistance. Shahr al-Shat forced the Italian government to dramatically escalate. The expeditionary force was increased from 25,000 to 100,000 men, 4 times the original deployment. This was far more than Italy had planned to commit. Italy even brought in askaris, colonial troops from Eritrea. The use of African troops to fight Arabs revealed how desperate the situation had become. Prime Minister Giolitti also escalated politically. On November 5th, he announced the full annexation of Libya. This was mostly symbolic, since Italy controlled only a few coastal towns. But the declaration ensured the war would continue. Historian Bruce Vandervoort argues, in retrospect, the annexation appears to have virtually assured that the Turks would have no option but to continue fighting. The Ottomans couldn't accept Italian sovereignty. The Arabs wouldn't accept foreign colonial rule. What Italy had imagined would be a quick colonial expedition had become a protracted guerrilla war. The Battle of Shah al-Shat was a major turning point. The Italians had held their ground tactically, but they had lost strategically. Modern weapons didn't guarantee quick victory when the enemy refused to fight conventional battles. These were lessons that should have been remembered. They would be forgotten again in 1914. By late fall 1911, the Italo-Turkish War had ground into stalemate. The Ottomans couldn't expel the Italians from their coastal strongholds. The Italians couldn't force a decisive battle because Ottoman and Arab forces waged full-scale guerrilla warfare. Italian naval supremacy meant the Ottomans couldn't send major reinforcements, but they managed to smuggle in weapons and volunteer officers who would become famous in Turkish history. Among them was Enver Bey, who would later become one of the triumvirate ruling the Ottoman Empire during World War I. Also arriving was Mustafa Kemal, the future Ataturk, founder of modern Turkey. Kemal made it to Libya by sailing to Egypt on a Russian ship while disguised as a journalist. He was wounded in the eye during fighting, but continued to command forces in the Derna sector. With 9,000 men, Kemal tied down 15,000 Italian troops. Ottoman commander Enver Bey and tribal leader Sheikh Omar al-Mukhtar committed to a clear strategy: keep the Italians pinned in coastal towns and exhaust them through attrition. Enver Bey understood the value of his Arab allies. I have become the master of the situation. Into my hands has fallen a power for which the various powers of Europe spend millions to have in their hands. And thus, this force has come to me without my spending a dime. But Arab leader Farhat al-Zawi made clear that Arab motivations were different. Our men are patriots in bare feet and rags, like your soldiers of the revolution, and not religious fanatics. If the Turkish government abandons us, we will proclaim that it has forfeited its right over our country. We will form the Republic of Tripolitania. The alliance was one of temporary convenience. Italian commanders desperately wanted to push into the desert and force a conventional battle. But they lacked intelligence about the interior, had inadequate logistics for desert warfare, and remained vulnerable to guerrilla ambushes. So, they advanced little by little, digging new trenches every 100 meters. A British journalist called it purely imbecile. The criticism was accurate. Italian forces were fighting a 20th century guerrilla war using 19th century colonial tactics. In December, the Italians tried to bring the enemy to battle at Ain Zara. On December 4th, 15,000 Italian troops attacked Ottoman trenches on high ground south of Tripoli. After fierce fighting, the defenders withdrew 40 kilometers south. Italian cavalry failed to surround the retreating forces. The Ottomans escaped once again, though they left much of their artillery behind. Italian authorities declared Ain Zara a major victory. Neutral journalists pointed out that after 3 months of fighting, Italy controlled slightly more coastal territory than before. Despite limited gains, the Ottomans were becoming more confident. Italian morale was dropping. Disease spread through Italian camps. Enver Bey noted, "Sometimes there come deserters who say very interesting things of the Italians. Almost everyday Italian losses from dysentery are about 20 men. The hospitals are full. The morale of the troops is low, and all want peace." Time appeared to be on the Ottoman side. There was always more desert to withdraw into. Italy couldn't win the war in Libya alone. The conflict had to be expanded. The Italo-Turkish War saw the first significant wartime use of airplanes for reconnaissance and bombing. The Italian 1st Aeroplane Flotilla had 9 aircraft, including Blériot and Nieuport monoplanes, plus 11 pilots. These primitive machines were about to change warfare forever. On October 23, 1911, Captain Carlo Piazza made the first ever official combat flight when he reconnoitred Ottoman positions along the coast for 1 hour. He returned with valuable intelligence about enemy troop movements and fortifications. Aviation had proven useful in its first test. On November 1st, Italians made the first ever bombing raid when pilots dropped Cipelli grenades into Ottoman camps near Tripoli. The military effect was minimal. The grenades were small and inaccurate. But the psychological impact was significant. Ottoman soldiers now had to worry about attacks from above. On October 25th, Ottoman gunners became the first to hit an enemy combat aircraft with anti-aircraft fire. Captain Giuseppe Rossi experienced a terrifying close call. We flew at an altitude of 600 meters and had covered 15 kilometers when we spotted the first group of Arab tents. These welcomed us with such a volley of accurate fire that I had half a mind to give up continuing the mission. He continued, anyway. At 100 meters away from the center of the camp, I gave the second signal. It was a wonderful sight. The bomb had erupted with the intended effect. But the joy of this perception was severely impaired by the incessant crackle of the volley of fire aimed at us. Then disaster nearly struck. I tried to climb but was unsuccessful, and so was passing over the left side of the camp when my companion shouted that he was wounded. I had turned around to look at him when the engine stopped and we began to descend. Happily, it started again, but we were struck by 2 more bullets. Rossi made it back to base. His observer survived. But the incident proved that flying combat missions was extraordinarily dangerous. Public fascination with aerial bombing was immense. Newspapers published dramatic accounts. The romantic image of aviators as modern knights captured the popular imagination. But the real military value of aviation wasn't bombing, it was reconnaissance. Photos taken from aircraft supplemented the limited maps available. Aerial observers could spot enemy troop movements that ground scouts couldn't detect. On several occasions, planes discovered and disrupted Ottoman ambushes. Observation balloons and aircraft gave Italian commanders a view of the battlefield that had never before been possible. The Italians systematically tested different uses for aircraft. They tried night reconnaissance. They experimented with aerial photography. They attempted to use aircraft for artillery spotting. Some experiments failed, but others proved the concept. Above all, the Italian aviation effort proved that aircraft were robust and reliable enough to be used in war. The machines could operate in harsh desert conditions. They could carry useful payloads. They could return crucial intelligence. The technology was ready for military adoption. Military observers from major powers watched closely and filed detailed reports. The British Royal Flying Corps, established in 1912, specifically referenced the Italian experience in Libya in its founding charter. French and German aviation programs accelerated development based on lessons from the Italo-Turkish War. The age of aerial warfare had begun over the Libyan desert. Within 2 years, aircraft would be flying over European battlefields. But in spring 1912, Italy still couldn't win the war in Libya. So Italy decided to bring pressure directly on Constantinople itself. As the war dragged into 1912 with no end in sight, Italian leadership concluded that only naval operations could force the Ottomans to negotiate. Operations in Libya were essentially suspended in favor of naval attacks closer to Constantinople. The first targets were in the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden. In January 1912, the Italian Navy intensified operations. Italian warships sank several Ottoman vessels and delivered weapons to anti-Ottoman Arab rebels in Yemen and Saudi Arabia. The goal was to stretch Ottoman military resources across multiple fronts. In February, Italian and Ottoman ships fought a pitched naval battle in Beirut harbour. The engagement resulted in a decisive Italian victory. But 66 Beirut residents were killed in the crossfire, bringing international attention to the expanding conflict. In April 1912, Italy took its most provocative step, sending a flotilla to the Dardanelles Straits. The Dardanelles was a vital international shipping lane giving access to Constantinople and the Black Sea. Russia's grain exports, crucial to the Russian economy, passed through the straits. British trade routes connected to the Black Sea. Any interference threatened the interests of multiple great powers. Following inconclusive naval duels between Italian ships and Ottoman shore batteries, the Ottomans closed and mined the straits to prevent a direct threat to the capital. This immediately drew protests from Britain and especially Russia. The Russian government couldn't afford the economic damage of closed straits. Russia pressured the Ottomans to reopen them, but also pressured Italy to stop threatening Constantinople. Britain added its voice to the diplomatic pressure. The Ottomans, facing overwhelming international opposition, were forced to reopen the Dardanelles to commercial shipping. Austria-Hungary watched these developments with alarm. Vienna desperately wanted to preserve the territorial status quo in the Balkans, which was enshrined in the Triple Alliance Treaty. If the Ottoman Empire collapsed, the entire Balkan region might explode into war. Austria's worst nightmare was Balkan instability spreading to its own restive populations. The Ottomans, meanwhile, couldn't take advantage of the divisions among Europeans. The empire was diplomatically isolated. The Young Turk regime was badly divided between those still loyal to the Sultan and those supporting the Revolutionary Committee of Union and Progress. In 1911 and 1912, there were 3 different Grand Viziers and 3 different foreign ministers. Political chaos prevented effective diplomacy. Despite great power concerns and even pressure from its own allies, Italy pressed ahead with its most ambitious operation. The goal: seize Ottoman islands in the Aegean Sea and force Constantinople to negotiate. Admiral Carlo Rocca Ray had been thinking about this strategy since October 1911. I think it might be useful for us in the current war to occupy some part of the Ottoman Empire that will compel them to accept peace. Unfortunately, we do not have a free hand, and so we cannot act on the west coast of the Balkan Peninsula, or by forcing the Dardanelles, go to Constantinople. But we can take some island, as a bargaining counter at least. Strategically, the island of Rhodes would be most valuable. Italy, was about to gamble everything on the Aegean Islands. The problem with seizing the Aegean Islands was diplomatic. The Dodecanese Islands were covered by the same Triple Alliance status quo agreement that protected the Balkans. Italy couldn't simply seize them without potentially violating treaty obligations to Austria and Germany. Italian diplomats worked to calm Austrian fears. They argued that the occupation would be temporary, merely a bargaining chip to force Ottoman negotiations. Once peace was achieved and Libya secured, Italy would return the islands. Austria-Hungary was sceptical, but eventually agreed to a temporary occupation. The Austrians only allowed this under heavy pressure from Germany. Germany wanted to strengthen the Triple Alliance before it came up for renewal in 1912. Better to let Italy have the islands temporarily than risk the alliance collapsing. Between April 28 and May 21, 1912, Italy seized 13 Ottoman islands in the Aegean, including Rhodes and the Dodecanese. There was almost no Ottoman military opposition except on Rhodes, where a small garrison put up brief resistance before surrendering. The Ottomans simply didn't have the naval power to defend or reinforce these islands. The occupation achieved Italy's strategic goal. It dramatically increased Ottoman internal divisions. The split widened between those Ottoman leaders who wanted to continue fighting and those who pushed for negotiated peace. With Italian forces now occupying territory so close to Constantinople, the pressure on the Ottoman government became unbearable. Italy now held valuable bargaining chips. The islands could be returned in exchange for Ottoman recognition of Italian control over Libya. Or they could be kept permanently if negotiations failed. The gamble had worked. The Ottoman government, facing military defeats in Libya, Italian control of strategic islands near Constantinople, internal political chaos, and the looming threat of Balkan aggression, finally began to seriously consider peace negotiations. But there was a complication. Italy had promised Austria that the island occupation would be temporary. Italian leaders were already beginning to think the islands were too valuable to return. Rhodes especially, with its strategic position controlling sea lanes, could anchor Italian power in the eastern Mediterranean. The seeds of a future diplomatic crisis had been planted. But that was a problem for later. For now, the pressure on the Ottomans was working. By summer 1912, there seemed to be a path to the peace table. But obstacles remained on both sides. The Italians were reluctant to compromise. They had already announced Libyan annexation and seized the Aegean Islands. Why negotiate when they seemed to be winning? The Ottomans expected major concessions since they hadn't been fully defeated militarily in Libya. The war there was a stalemate, not an Italian victory. Surely that counted for something at the negotiating table. Both sides would need to be pushed harder toward peace. And external events were about to provide that push. Russian-led peace talks in May 1912 failed to produce agreement. A new round of talks began in Switzerland in June. The Ottomans offered to accept Libya, becoming an independent state within an Italian zone of occupation. This face-saving formula would allow the Ottomans to avoid the humiliation of directly ceding territory. Italian demands were far more substantial. They wanted full sovereignty over Libya and retention of the Aegean Islands. The Swiss talks collapsed. One Italian diplomat put the blame on his Turkish counterpart. The Ottoman delegate had in his baggage only one word: autonomy. But internal pressure within Italy was growing dramatically. The war was becoming less popular, especially among the working class. Socialist opposition to the colonial adventure was intensifying. The war was costing Italy 47% of its total government expenditure. Even formerly pro-war newspapers were turning against the conflict. Italian soldiers were tired of the war. Unrest spread in the trenches. Desertion rates increased. The Italian military was exhausted from months of guerrilla warfare with no end in sight. On July 18th, the Italians tried one last action to force negotiations. 5 specially camouflaged Italian torpedo boats attempted to sneak into the Dardanelles and attack the Turkish fleet at anchor. Ottoman sentries spotted them and drove them away with coastal artillery. The raid failed militarily. But Italian newspapers exaggerated it into a bold strike against the heart of the Ottoman Empire. Journalist Giuseppe Bevione wasn't present during the attack, but wrote poetically, "The water boiled around the torpedo boats from stem to stern, and jets of water flew high as shells fell with horrible thuds. The air was full of flashes, of flames, explosions, and splinters. Convulsive, foaming, full of glare and reflections, the sea seemed to become a huge fiery furnace. But at the zenith shone always the star of Italy." Pure propaganda. But it served its purpose domestically. Peace talks resumed in August, with a new Ottoman government under Gazi Muhtar Pasha more willing to negotiate. Pressure from other European powers helped move the process forward. More significantly, the First Balkan War erupted in early October 1912. The Ottomans suddenly faced a far more serious threat than Italy. Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, and Montenegro were invading Ottoman territories in Europe. Fighting on multiple fronts was impossible. The Ottoman Empire had to make peace with Italy immediately. There was no other choice. The peace treaty ending the Italo-Turkish War was signed on October 18, 1912. The terms reflected a diplomatic compromise designed to let both sides save face. The Ottomans declared Libya independent, technically avoiding the humiliation of ceding territory directly to Italy. Italy then immediately declared sovereignty over that independent Libya. The Ottomans agreed not to object. The Sultan would continue to be recognized as the religious head of Libyan Muslims. Italy promised to return the Aegean Islands, a promise it would never honor. The islands would remain Italian until World War II. Italy also agreed to pay some minor reparations. Other European powers quickly recognized Italian control over Libya. So Italy had won the Italo-Turkish War and taken Libya from the Ottoman Empire. When peace was announced, Italian elites were overjoyed. Popular historian Cesare Causa proclaimed, "Praise be to God. We are no longer nothing. We are an old people that has found its youth and strength. We are a great nation." The majority of Italians were less enthusiastic. The war had not brought the impressive victory they'd been promised. 3,500 Italians had died, mostly from disease. Another 4,250 were wounded. The victory did little to improve Italy's military reputation with other great powers. The new Libyan possession proved extraordinarily difficult to govern. Libyan Arabs would go on to resist Italian rule for years. Sheikh Omar al-Mukhtar would fight Italian occupation until his capture and execution in 1931, 20 years after the war ended. Italian authorities responded with brutal repression, establishing concentration camps and conducting mass executions. For the Ottoman Empire, losing their last African province reinforced their reputation as the sick man of Europe. But they managed to save some face with the complicated arrangement. Losing unprofitable Libya actually improved Ottoman finances. Ottoman casualties were similar to Italian losses, despite Italian technological superiority. The suffering of Libyan people was immense. Thousands died. Thousands more became refugees. Special refugee offices were established in Constantinople for Libyans fleeing Italian occupation. The Italo-Turkish War had a unique dual nature. It was the last typical 19th century colonial small war of European imperial expansion. But it also previewed 20th century warfare with trenches, machine guns, airplanes, and guerrilla resistance that could successfully resist conventional armies. The war in the air influenced military thought across Europe. The war was referenced in the founding charter of the British Royal Flying Corps. The Dardanelles would become a key British objective in 1915 during the disastrous Gallipoli campaign. Most significantly, the Italo-Turkish War destabilized the region exactly as Austria-Hungary had feared. By exposing Ottoman weakness so completely, Italy had emboldened the empire's enemies. The Balkan states had watched carefully and drawn conclusions. If Italy could defeat the Ottomans, surely they could too. As Italian diplomat, Giolitti himself had worried in 1911. The integrity of the Ottoman Empire is a condition for Europe's balance and peace. Is it truly in Italy's interest to shatter into pieces one of the cornerstones of the old building? And what if, after we attack Turkey, the Balkans move as well? Could we take upon ourselves the responsibility for igniting the gunpowder? His fears were about to be realized. The Balkans were already moving. The Italo-Turkish War alone didn't start the First World War, but it was one of the sparks that lit the long fuse of 1914. The second domino had fallen. The third was about to tip. For centuries, the Ottoman Empire controlled the multi-ethnic, multi-religious Balkan Peninsula. Turks, Greeks, Serbs, Bulgarians, Albanians, Jews, and dozens of other groups lived in communities that had overlapped and intermingled for generations. Different religions coexisted uneasily: Orthodox Christians, Muslims, Catholics, Jews. But the 19th century brought dramatic change. As the empire grew weaker, nationalism among Balkan peoples grew stronger. New states emerged from Ottoman control: Montenegro, Greece, Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria. They gained first informal independence, then formal recognition. The process was violent: uprisings against Ottoman rule, brutal repression, independence wars, great power intervention. The decisive moment came with the Russo-Turkish War of 1877–78. Russia's crushing victory ensured the independence of the Balkan states. But it also created a large Russian-friendly Bulgaria that alarmed other European powers. Concerned Austria-Hungary occupied Ottoman Bosnia-Herzegovina in 1878. Britain worried Russia might get too close to the Turkish Straits. So the great powers met in Berlin to modify the borders. The goal: limit Russian influence. They returned most of Macedonia to the Ottomans. This decision enraged Bulgarian leaders like Ivan Geshov. When we read the agreement in which a short-sighted diplomacy in Berlin partitioned our homeland, we were left crushed and thunderstruck. Was such an injustice possible? Could such an injustice be reversed? The peace of 1878 didn't stabilize the region. No state was satisfied with the resulting borders. Serbia and Bulgaria even fought a brief war in 1885. Greece and the Ottomans warred in 1897. By the start of the 20th century, tensions in the Balkans were running high. The new states hoped to expand their territory at Ottoman expense. The great powers remained nervous about the balance of power. Austria-Hungary worried that Serbia was dangerous. Some in Serbia wanted closer ties with their fellow Serbs living in the dual monarchy. Serbia had close relations with Russia, which made Vienna even more anxious. Russia was glad to have new Balkan allies and wanted access to the Turkish Straits. But Russia worried that someone else might seize Constantinople if the Ottomans collapsed completely. The Ottoman Empire was in a state of crisis. Defeats had cost much of its European lands. Violent instability plagued Constantinople. The powder keg was packed tight. All it needed was a spark. 1908 would be a decisive year. The Young Turk Revolution in July brought a fresh constitution and desires to modernize the empire and army, create a stronger Ottoman identity, and preserve Ottoman territories, especially Macedonia. But in October, Austria-Hungary shocked the Balkans and Europe by annexing Bosnia after 30 years of occupation. Vienna also withdrew from the Sanjak of Novi Pazar. Russia was outraged at the unilateral action. Bulgaria used the opportunity to sever all formal ties to the Ottomans. The result? More international tension, more chaos in Constantinople. 1909 brought a conservative counter-coup attempt against the new Ottoman constitution, followed by a counter-coup, yet another constitution, and a new sultan, Mehmet V. Political chaos consumed the capital. 1910, even formal control of Crete was lost. Albanians revolted for more autonomy, with Montenegrin support. The empire was bleeding territory. The Balkan states also had their share of problems. Serbia and Greece suffered coups. All nations struggled to control their influential and nationalistic military leaders. Then came the Italo-Turkish War of 1911–12. Traditionally, Britain, France, and Germany had supported the Ottoman Empire to prevent total collapse. Now they allowed Italy to attack and occupy Ottoman Libya and the Dodecanese Islands. The war ended with defeat for the Ottomans. They tried to limit losses at the negotiating table, but couldn't hide their fundamental weakness. The Balkan states had watched closely. They planned to take advantage. And they had Russian encouragement. If Italy, a power that had struggled against Arab guerrillas in Libya, could defeat the Ottomans, surely the Balkan states could too. The calculations were being made in Belgrade, Sofia, Athens, and Cetinje. Ottoman weakness was exposed. The empire seemed ripe for dismemberment. All that was needed was coordination among the Balkan states. And that coordination was about to happen. Serbian and Bulgarian governments began alliance talks in fall 1911, just as the Italo-Turkish War erupted. In March 1912, they agreed on a defensive alliance. In May, this changed to an offensive alliance. Soon after, Montenegro and Greece joined with separate agreements. The Balkan League was born. The League resolved to make war on the Ottoman Empire to gain what they felt were lands belonging to their peoples. But they had conflicting claims, all dating back to medieval times. Serbia, Bulgaria, and Greece wanted Macedonia. Bulgaria and Greece both wanted Thrace. Montenegro and Serbia wanted the Sanjak of Novi Pazar, the area around the port of Scutari on the Adriatic, and Kosovo. The Albanians hoped for autonomy that would include Scutari and Kosovo. In most of these regions, the mix of nationalities and religions didn't align with political plans. Turks, Albanians, Bulgarians, Serbs, Montenegrins, Greeks, Jews, and other groups lived in communities that had overlapped for centuries. Clear borders were impossible without massive population displacement. The League wanted to take territory from the Ottomans, but made few formal agreements on how it would be divided. Serbia and Bulgaria agreed on how to divide part of Macedonia, but part was considered a disputed zone that could be assigned after the war with Russian arbitration. This was a recipe for future conflict. Greece and Bulgaria made no formal agreement about who would get Salonika. Montenegro and Serbia had overlapping claims. The Albanians weren't consulted at all about their future. So, the Balkan League determined to make war on the Ottomans without a clear post-war plan to divide the spoils. This would prove catastrophic. But first, they would have to defeat the Ottoman army. And, despite Ottoman defeats against Italy, this was no guaranteed outcome. The Ottomans still had troops, still had weapons, and still controlled significant fortified positions. The Young Turk government in Constantinople, despite its internal divisions, was determined not to lose more European territory without a fight. Some Ottoman officers who had fought in Libya, including Enver Bey and Mustafa Kemal, were returning to defend the homeland. The stage was set for a war that would redraw the map of the Balkans. A war that would bring Europe to the brink of general conflict. A war that would normalize atrocities and ethnic violence on a scale that would horrify the world. And a war that would light the fuse leading directly to Sarajevo in June 1914. The third domino was about to fall. The First Balkan War began on October 8, 1912. Montenegro attacked the Ottomans ahead of schedule, trying to get a jump on rival Serbia for territorial claims. The rest of the Balkan League members quickly gave the Ottomans a pro forma ultimatum. Hard-pressed Ottoman Grand Vizier Muhtar wanted to save the peace and even demobilized part of the Ottoman Third Army in Thrace. But the influential Young Turk Party, the Committee for Union and Progress, wanted to fight. The empire was again on the brink of civil war. On October 16th, it declared war on the Balkan League. Most European observers expected the Ottomans would win, is greater than the empire's. Population of 24 million was more than twice the League's combined 10 million. On paper, the Ottomans could field 600,000 men. Regular troops had gained experience fighting the Italians and rebels in Albania and Macedonia. But the Ottomans faced serious problems. Many of their best officers were still stuck in Libya or just returning. Reserve troops were badly trained and equipped with a mishmash of weaponry. The Ottoman navy was weak, and the army only had 315,000 men actually stationed in Europe. The Balkan League could count on 825,000 soldiers, 350,000 Bulgarians, 230,000 Serbs, 200,000 Greeks, and 45,000 Montenegrins. Most soldiers were peasant conscripts. They were equipped with a variety of European weapons, including French and German artillery and a few observation aircraft. The Greek navy ensured control of the Aegean Sea. On October 10th, the Great Powers issued a statement saying they wanted to keep the territorial status quo if war came. What they really meant, they wouldn't allow the Ottomans to expand if they won. The statement was essentially permission for the League to attack. All over the Balkans, families saw their young men off to the front. Bulgarian Nedko Kablashkov's 21-year-old son Anton was among them. By noon, Anton's chest was overflowing with flowers from well-wishers, and we sent him off to the train station. On the way, we ran into a crippled Greek. This meeting was a bad omen. I feared that my son would also be crippled. I wanted us to go back, but I didn't want to discourage him, so we continued on towards the station. The father's omen would prove tragically prophetic. In eastern Thrace, 3 Bulgarian armies faced the Ottoman First Army. The Ottomans thought the Bulgarians would move on Macedonia, so that's where they deployed most of their troops. Instead, the Bulgarians sent the bulk of their units toward the fortress towns of Edirne and Kirk-Kilise on the road to Constantinople. Bulgarian troops surrounded the Ottoman garrison at Edirne. Deputy Commander-in-Chief Mikhail Savov said he was ready to sacrifice 100,000 men to storm it. The Bulgarians didn't storm the fortress immediately. But young Anton Kablashkov would soon be killed just outside its walls. His father's fears would come true. East of Edirne, Ottoman First Army commander Abdullah Pasha thought he outnumbered the enemy. On October 21st, he sent his troops forward in a hasty advance. At the Battle of Kirk-Kilise, the outnumbered Ottomans fought for 3 days before the Bulgarians broke their lines. The fighting was brutal. Modern weapons transformed the battlefield into a killing ground. Artillery fire tore through Ottoman formations. Machine guns mowed down attackers. The Ottomans fought with determination, but were outgunned and outmaneuvered. The Bulgarians could probably have completely smashed the Ottoman army if they had pursued aggressively. Instead, they rested. Their commanders were exhausted. Their supply lines were stretched. Their troops needed rest and reorganization. This pause gave the Ottomans a crucial opportunity. They rushed in reinforcements from Macedonia and restored discipline. What could have been a total rout became a manageable defeat. Ottoman senior officer Muhtar Pasha reflected on the disaster. The causes of our defeat are to be found in our bad military organization and in the lack of discipline of our reservists. But the principal cause was the rain, which had continued for a week, completely destroying the morale of our army, and for 3 days rendering impassable the roads and fields to our trains and artillery. Blaming the weather. Classic military excuse. But logistics truly were a disaster. Ottoman supply lines collapsed in the mud. Artillery couldn't be moved. Ammunition couldn't reach the front. Even well-trained troops can't fight without supplies. Meanwhile, young Anton Kablashkov was killed outside the walls of Edirne. His father's premonition had come true. Another young life lost in the Balkans. The Bulgarians had won the first major battle, and they were advancing toward Constantinople. The question now, could the Ottomans stop them before they reached the capital? On October 29th, the Bulgarians attacked fresh Ottoman defensive positions at Leoburgas. At first, the Ottomans were able to hold the line. Ottoman artillery was initially effective. But when logistics couldn't furnish the guns with enough shells, Bulgarian superiority told. The Bulgarians defeated them thanks to determined infantry attacks and superior artillery coordination. Each side suffered 20,000 killed and wounded. This was the largest battle in Europe between 1871 and 1914. Larger than any Franco-Prussian war battle. Larger than anything Europe had seen in a generation. And it was just the beginning. On November 2nd, reeling Ottoman forces retreated to the Katilka line, just 30 kilometers from Imperial Constantinople. The Ottoman government requested an armistice. Tsar Ferdinand of Bulgaria refused and didn't inform his allies. The Bulgarian dream: reach the old Byzantine capital. Restore Bulgarian glory. Plant the Bulgarian flag over the city Bulgarians called Tsarigrad. On November 17th, the Bulgarians tried to break through the Katilka line. They threw everything they had at the Ottoman defences. But three factors stopped them: fierce Ottoman resistance by troops defending their capital, stretched Bulgarian logistics at the end of long supply lines, and a cholera outbreak that swept through Bulgarian ranks. The Katilka line held. Constantinople was safe. For now. But the Bulgarian advance on land and the Greek navy off the coast meant Ottoman forces in the rest of the Balkans were completely cut off from any hope of reinforcement. The strategic situation was dire for the empire. Some towns and villages, captured by Bulgarian troops in Thrace, were populated by Bulgarians who considered themselves liberated. Elena Bizeva later recalled when Bulgarian irregulars entered her town. When the people entered the church, they took off their fezes and held them in their hands. Then they all tossed them to the ground and trampled them. It was like they were taking out all their anger at the Turks on those fezes. For some, this was liberation. For others, it was conquest. The difference depended on which ethnic group you belonged to. The Bulgarians had pushed to within sight of Constantinople. But they couldn't break through. The war in Thrace had reached a stalemate. Meanwhile, in Macedonia, Serbian forces were about to engage the Ottomans in a decisive battle. In Macedonia, Serbian forces came up against Ottoman resistance quicker than General Putnik expected. The Battle of Kumanovo would test Serbian resolve. The Serbs outnumbered the Ottoman Vardar army 100,000 to 58,000, but the Ottomans under Zeki Pasha launched the first attacks on October 23rd. In driving rain and mud, the Serbs counterattacked at great cost that observers compared to Japanese attacks in the Russo-Japanese War. The firepower of modern artillery and machine guns meant soldiers dug trenches and foxholes to keep out of harm's way. Trench warfare was emerging in the Balkans, just as it had in Manchuria. Serbian medic Dragoljub Radojkovic was in the midst of the fighting. I look out of the trench and see a wounded man on the parapet. I shout to him, but he doesn't hear me. He's hit again and faints. Some men carry him in, and blood is gushing from his neck. I wrap one bandage, then another. We get him onto a stretcher, but the man dies. In the end, Serbian artillery carried the day. The Serbs won the Battle of Kumanovo. The victory earned Putnik the title Voivoda, Duke. It left the Serbs in possession of the part of Macedonia disputed with the Bulgarians. And it routed the Ottomans, who fled south. The result was chaos amongst the local Muslim population. Many dead and wounded on both sides. Radojkovic at the train station a day after the battle. In the morning, we went down to the train station in Kumanovo. Captured Turks, the Turkish people, women, children, everything was crowded there. The trains were not running. One train, freight wagons, a train full of wounded, not moving, a train full of dead Turks. Blood dripped from the wagon onto the rails. The horror of modern war in vivid detail. The Serbs pursued the defeated Ottomans and pushed them back at the battles of Prilep and Bitola. Ottoman forces withdrew to southern Albania. The Serbs also moved forces west towards Scutari and the Adriatic coast, where they would join Montenegrin forces besieging the town. In the north, the Serbs captured the Sanjak of Novi Pazar and the town of Prizren, which the Montenegrins had wanted. Serbian troops also entered Kosovo, where they faced resistance from local Albanians. The Albanian question was complicating everything. Within weeks of the war's start, Serbian forces controlled most of Macedonia and Kosovo. The Ottoman armies that had held these territories for centuries were shattered. And in the south, Greek forces were racing for the greatest prize of all, Salonika. In the south, the Greek army of Thessaly made straight for Salonika. Greece was interested in Macedonia, but prioritized the drive for Salonika. They had to reach it before the Bulgarians. The strategic port was the prize everyone wanted. Greek troops pushed the Ottomans aside at Sarantoporos Pass. They had more difficulty at Yanitsa, but overcame resistance. The way to Salonika was open. On November 7th, the Greek army surrounded the city. A Bulgarian division rushed south in a desperate race for the prize. The Bulgarian commander sent a message ahead, asking the Ottomans to surrender to him instead of to the Greeks. He was too late. The Ottoman commander replied that he only had one Salonika. He had surrendered it to the Greeks on November 8th. This was a critical League victory. Ottoman forces were now completely cut off from any hope of reinforcement. It was also a personal tragedy for Ottoman officer Mustafa Kemal. Salonika was his hometown. The loss fueled Kemal's anger at Constantinople leadership. Then one day I heard my homeland, Salonika, my mother, my sister, my relatives and acquaintances, were handed over to the enemy by the very Ottoman leadership, who expelled me for unveiling the truth about them. Kemal also said he would have every Ottoman officer above the rank of major fired. His bitterness would shape his later actions. After taking Salonika, Greek and Bulgarian troops began an uneasy joint presence in the city. Seeds of future conflict were being planted. Both nations claimed the city. Both had soldiers occupying it. Neither was willing to back down. In the west, Greek troops also made progress. They besieged the Ottoman fortress at Yanina. It would take months to fall. By late November 1912, the Balkan League had achieved stunning victories on all fronts. The Bulgarians were 30 kilometers from Constantinople. The Serbs controlled most of Macedonia and Kosovo. The Greeks held Salonika and were besieging Yanina. The Montenegrins were besieging Scutari. The Ottoman Empire in Europe was collapsing. Nearly all of Ottoman Europe was now under League control, except for the fortresses of Edirne, Yanina and Scutari, and the Katalka line protecting Constantinople. But the fighting had also unleashed ethnic violence on a scale Europe hadn't seen in generations. As the Balkan League armies advanced, Christian and Muslim civilian populations suffered from atrocities committed by all sides. The situation was made worse by the presence of irregular forces, local fighters supporting their countrymen's armies, who blurred the line between soldiers and non-combatants. Some Christians turned on Muslim officials, who had repressed them in the past. Others attacked Muslim landowners before seizing their lands. Property that had been in families for generations changed hands through violence. A British journalist travelling with the Bulgarian army reported, "The track of the Bulgarian army in Thrace is marked by 80 miles of ruined villages." Greek commander Crown Prince Constantine ordered Muslim villages destroyed. He claimed Muslims were shooting at his troops from civilian areas. Whether this was true or merely an excuse for ethnic cleansing, the result was the same: systematic destruction. Greek soldier Stratis Miravilis later included his experience in his writing. All male prisoners in the village were to be executed. I was opposite an old Turk. His grandfatherly face was bruised, he whispered prayers, and his silky beard moved in the wind. I pulled the trigger, and he fell into the mud like he was struck by lightning. After the executions, they set the village on fire. Suddenly, a frenzied crowd rushed over, children and women freed from the mosque where we had imprisoned them. They run to the corpses screaming to look for their loved ones. Then Miravilis added, "This memory lives and circulates inside me like an anguished virus." The trauma of perpetrating atrocities haunted soldiers for the rest of their lives. But it didn't stop the killings. Constantinople was filled with hundreds of thousands of Muslim refugees. The old city turned into a vast camp. The famous Blue Mosque became a refugee shelter. The Hagia Sophia Mosque was turned into a cholera hospital. Scenes of desperation and suffering filled the ancient capital. The British consul at Salonika was blunt. The result of the massacre of Muslims at the beginning of the war, of the looting of their goods in the ensuing months, of the settling of Christians in their villages, of their persecution by Christian neighbours, of their torture and beating by Greek troops, has been the creation of a state of terror among the Islamic population. Their one desire is to escape from Macedonia and to be again in a free land. Ethnic cleansing in all but name. Violence was begetting more violence. The scale of the refugee crisis was staggering. Hundreds of thousands of Muslims fled toward Constantinople, or east toward Anatolia. Tens of thousands of Christians also fled, some toward the League states, others toward Constantinople, fearing they would be blamed for League atrocities. Roads were clogged with refugees. Many died of exposure, disease, or starvation during the journey. Those who made it to Constantinople overwhelmed the city's capacity to care for them. Disease spread rapidly in the overcrowded conditions. This was total war of a kind Europe hadn't seen since the 30 Years' War. Civilian populations were being deliberately targeted based on ethnicity and religion. Entire communities were being erased. In just 2 months, the Balkan Wars had normalized ethnic violence and population displacement on a massive scale. Europe was learning how to commit atrocities efficiently, and no one was stopping it. By late November 1912, a few weeks of fighting had produced decisive League victories. Nearly all of Ottoman Europe was captured, except for fortresses and the Katalka line. The Ottomans were exhausted and demoralized. On November 28th, Albanian representatives meeting in Vlore declared independence. Austria-Hungary and Italy immediately supported this declaration to keep Serbia landlocked. Albania's future became a key diplomatic issue. On December 3rd, the Ottomans signed an armistice with Bulgaria, Montenegro, and Serbia. Greek military operations continued for a time. The Ottomans still held important positions. They still had reserves in Asia. Militarily, they might have had a chance to recover. But the empire had no allies. This time, the great powers would not support the empire as they had in the past. Even Germany declared the war a free fight with no favour. Berlin wouldn't risk a European war over Ottoman territories. The powers now said they would accept border changes in favour of the League. Even Austro-Hungarian Foreign Minister Leopold von Berchtold said Vienna would not oppose Serbian expansion, except for an Adriatic port. Austria was determined to keep Serbia landlocked. Russia was worried the Bulgarians might actually get to Constantinople. They urged restraint on all sides. Greater than Russia wanted access to the Straits, but didn't want Bulgaria controlling Constantinople. The situation was delicate. Every great power had interests in the Balkans. Every great power had allies among the belligerents. And every great power was watching the others nervously. The armistice was supposed to lead to peace negotiations, but finding terms acceptable to everyone would prove nearly impossible. The Balkan League members couldn't agree on how to divide the spoils. The Ottomans refused to give up certain key territories. The great powers all had different priorities. What seemed like the end of the First Balkan War was actually just a pause. The fighting would resume. And before it was truly over, Europe would come closer to general war than it had been since Waterloo. Events in the Balkans pushed Europe toward war. On November 21, 1912, Austria-Hungary acted to prevent Serbia from permanently occupying the Adriatic coast. Vienna mobilized 6 army corps, 3 facing the Balkans and 3 facing Russia. This was a clear threat. Kaiser Wilhelm secretly assured the Austrians, if Russia mobilizes, Germany will support Austria. It was a blank check, the same blank check that would be repeated in July 1914. In response to Austrian moves, the Tsar held a meeting with his war council. The Russian army drew up plans for partial mobilization. Generals were eager to act. But the council decided not to mobilize. Partly out of fear of provoking Germany. Partly because some ministers didn't want to risk war over Serbian access to the sea. The stakes didn't seem high enough to gamble on general European war. Europe was minutes from general war. They backed down, this time. But the pattern had been established. Crisis. Mobilization threats. Backing down at the last second. Each side learning that you could play with fire and not get burned. Until you couldn't. The German government didn't know how close the Russians had come to mobilizing. Germany held its own infamous War Council meeting on December 8th. Chief of the General Staff von Moltke felt Germany should declare war now, before Russia got any stronger. Better now than later, he argued. But in the end, the council decided against it. Not yet. But the precedent was set. Some in the German military were now openly discussing the inevitability of European war. They were calculating when would be the best time to fight. This thinking would shape German decisions in July 1914. For now, diplomacy prevailed. But the crisis revealed dangerous truths. The alliance systems were rigid. Austria, Hungary, and Germany would act together. Russia had to support Serbia or lose all influence in the Balkans. France would support Russia. A local Balkan conflict could become a continental war within days. Military leaders on all sides were convinced that mobilization meant war, and that whoever mobilized first would have crucial advantages. This created pressure to act quickly in any crisis. Speed was everything, which meant diplomatic solutions had to be found fast or not at all. Nationalist passions in the Balkans were intense and growing. Serbian ambitions threatened Austria-Hungary's territorial integrity. Austria's determination to limit Serbia threatened Russia's influence. These were existential issues for the powers involved. The November crisis passed, but everyone understood how close they had come, and everyone drew their own lessons from what had happened. Some concluded that firmness and threats could prevent war. Others concluded that the next crisis might not end so peacefully. Military planners updated their mobilization schedules. Diplomats tried to strengthen alliance commitments. Everyone was preparing for the possibility that the next Balkan crisis might trigger the general European war they had so narrowly avoided. They didn't have to wait long. Following the war scare and December armistice, 2 parallel conferences took place in London on December 16th and 17th. At the first conference, Ottoman delegate Reshid Pasha said his government would give up Macedonia and Salonika, but not Edirne, eastern Thrace, or the 4 islands at the mouth of the Dardanelles that Greece was demanding, is less than Hasson. The Ottomans also insisted on an independent Albania, rather than it being split between the Serbs, Montenegrins, and Greeks. This aligned with Austrian interests, which wanted Albania as a buffer to keep Serbia landlocked. The Bulgarians made a new demand for Edirne to compensate for lands they might lose to the Serbs. This was a particular sticking point because the fortress city was important for the safety of Constantinople. Reshid Pasha put it simply to the Bulgarian representative, "Edirne is a window into our harem." The metaphor was clear. Giving up Edirne would leave Constantinople vulnerable and exposed. The Ottomans would not accept it. Greeks and Bulgarians argued over who would get Salonika. Serbs and Bulgarians argued over Macedonia. No one could agree. Meanwhile, at the separate Great Powers Conference, the main topic was the borders of Albania. This was of critical importance for Austria-Hungary to limit Serbian power. Austria wanted a large Albania that would include Kosovo and reach the Adriatic coast. Serbia wanted a small Albania that would leave Kosovo and the coast in Serbian hands. The Albanian question threatened to trigger another European war. Russia supported Serbian claims. Austria-Hungary refused to back down. The tension was palpable. But events in Constantinople overtook diplomacy. On January 23, 1913, a young Turk government took power again after yet another coup. Then War Minister Nazim Pasha was murdered in the palace. Supported by influential Turkish officers like Enver Bey, many from the Balkan lands now lost, they decided to continue the war to prevent the loss of Thrace. New Ottoman Foreign Minister Nuruddin Effendi was defiant. "If Adrianople continues to resist, we shall fight to relieve her. If Adrianople falls, we shall fight to retake her." The coup was driven by nationalism and anger over the proposed peace terms. Young officers who had grown up in the Balkans couldn't accept losing their homelands. Better to keep fighting than to accept such humiliation. Negotiations collapsed. The armistice ended. The First Balkan War would continue. The Ottomans were taking a huge gamble. They had already lost most battles. Their army was demoralized. They had no allies. But nationalist pride and military pressure forced the government to reject peace. The war would resume, and this time it would end with total Ottoman defeat in Europe. Ottoman troops, including Mustafa Kemal, landed at Gallipoli on February 7, 1913. At first, they pushed the Bulgarians back around Bulair. Brief Ottoman success raised hopes that the tide might turn. But the Bulgarians rallied. The Ottoman attack failed with the loss of 6,000 dead to just 114 Bulgarians. It was a devastating defeat despite the initial success. The Gallipoli Peninsula would become famous again in 1915, when British and Anzac forces would attempt to force the Dardanelles. But in 1913, it was the scene of Ottoman military failure. Elsewhere, the Greeks took Yanina on March 6 after months of siege. The Ottoman garrison, starving and out of ammunition, finally surrendered. French journalist Gustave Cirilli described the state of people in the starving city. It was like a scene out of a fantastical tale to see these human rags, with protruding teeth, devouring a sort of bread, black lava, in which the barely ground seeds fell out in yellow spots. Those who did not get their share of the fought-over morsels watched the others savour them with envious tears in their eyes. The horror of siege warfare. Civilians starving while soldiers fought. The human cost of these wars was mounting. The Bulgarians and Serbians finally captured Edirne on March 26th. The fortress that was supposed to be the window into the harem had fallen. Constantinople's defences were compromised. The fall of Edirne was a psychological blow to the Ottomans. The city had been Ottoman for over 500 years. It was the second most important city in European Turkey after Constantinople. Losing it meant the empire's European holdings were effectively finished. At Scutari, Serbian troops arrived to help the Montenegrins besiege the town. The Montenegrins ignored warnings from the great powers and assaulted the city. A combined fleet of the powers blockaded Montenegro in response. The Serbs, not wanting to antagonize the great powers, withdrew. But the Montenegrins managed to take the city on April 24th. Just days later, they agreed to give it up to a future independent Albania. The great powers had made their will clear. Albania would be independent, and Serbia would remain landlocked. The Ottomans had no choice but to accept a peace deal. Military defeat was total. The treasury was empty. The army was demoralized. No reinforcements were coming. No allies would help. The Young Turk coup had gambled on military success and lost. The belligerents signed the Treaty of London on May 30th, 1913. The terms were devastating for the Ottoman Empire. Ottoman Europe was reduced to a small strip of land outside Constantinople. Macedonia was gone. Thrace was gone. The Principality of Albania was created as an independent state. After more than 600 years, the Ottoman presence in the Balkans was nearly finished. The First Balkan War was over, but the Second was about to begin. Even before the First Balkan War had ended, further conflict was brewing. The Balkan League members disputed where the new borders would be, and Romania, which hadn't participated in the First War, was now making demands. Romania wanted southern Dobruja, which was part of Bulgaria. In May 1913, the great powers awarded the town of Silistra to Romania. This angered both sides. It made some Bulgarians doubt Russia as a reliable ally. Bulgarians were frustrated because, in their view, they had won the strategically important Thrace battles and suffered the heaviest casualties. But the Serbs were left in possession of most of Macedonia and didn't want to honor the pre-war agreement about dividing it. Bulgaria felt cheated. Bulgaria and Greece were still in conflict over Salonika. Both had troops in the city. Both claimed it. Neither would back down. Russia tried to mediate between Serbia and Bulgaria. The two rivals couldn't agree. The Russians were nervous about Bulgarian troops so close to Constantinople. They didn't want Bulgaria getting too powerful. The Bulgarian army was in a fragile state. Many soldiers were exhausted from months of war. Some were willing to split Macedonia if it meant peace and going home. But the Bulgarian government and military leadership felt they had sacrificed too much to accept losing Macedonia. General Savov told the government, either send the men home or go to war now. The army couldn't stay mobilized indefinitely. Soldiers were deserting. Morale was dropping. Without strong Russian backing, Sofia feared it might lose Macedonia for good. Better to fight now while the army was still mobilized than to demobilize and risk losing everything at the negotiating table. On June 29, 1913, Tsar Ferdinand ordered an attack against Serbia and Greece. It's not clear how much the civilian government knew about this before the shooting started. Possibly the Tsar was acting unilaterally. Possibly the military took action without full civilian approval. Either way, the Second Balkan War had begun. The Bulgarian Prime Minister tried to stop the fighting. He sent urgent messages to military commanders, ordering them to halt operations. But it was too late. The Greeks and Serbs could claim Bulgaria was the aggressor. They agreed to divide Macedonia between them. Montenegro joined Serbia. Bulgaria would face 3 enemies instead of 1. Bulgaria's gamble had already failed, and it was about to get much worse. The Bulgarian attack was poorly coordinated. Different Bulgarian armies weren't cooperating effectively. The element of surprise was wasted through poor execution. By July 8th, the Serbs defeated the Bulgarians at Bregalnica. The Greeks defeated a smaller Bulgarian army around Kilkis and Doiran at the same time. They eliminated isolated Bulgarian units at Salonika. Bulgarian Mikhail Majarov's son was killed in the fighting against the Greeks. I lost my very last hope. From that moment forth, I became a man haunted by grief. All around me seemed to go dark. All the misery and all the sorrow of Bulgaria appeared to me to be twice as great. Each and every object in my home served as a reminder to me of my lost happiness. Personal tragedies multiplied across the Balkans. Families who had already lost sons in the First War were losing more in the Second. On July 11th, Greek and Serb forces met. The front stabilized. Bulgaria was being pushed back on all sides. Retreating Bulgarians attacked Greek, Turkish, and Serbian civilians, claiming they had aided the enemy. Advancing Greek and Serbian troops committed atrocities against Bulgarian civilians, also claiming they had been attacked. The cycle of violence continued. Turkish civilian Aybosh Aga watched Bulgarian refugees fleeing and felt empathy despite the ethnic differences. A Bulgarian peasant was leading a scrawny donkey on the wooden saddle of which sat a child, her bare legs dangling on one side. The misery, the look of dread and utter agony in the small blinking eyes of the pock-marked face with the yellow straggly beard were the very embodiment of human fear and despair. No, not human. It was the animal dread of cattle at the slaughterhouse, the wild, glassy stare of terror in a cornered animal. Humanity witnessing its own degradation. Bulgaria's military position was collapsing. The Serbs were advancing from the west. The Greeks were pushing from the south. And worse was coming. Romania saw its chance. The Ottoman Empire saw an opportunity for revenge. Both were about to join the war against Bulgaria. Bulgaria had gambled everything on a quick victory. The gamble had failed. And now Bulgaria would pay the price. On July 10th, Romania entered the war to take all of southern Dobruja. 250,000 Romanian troops of the Army of the Danube entered Bulgaria and moved towards Sofia. The Bulgarians decided not to offer organized resistance to the Romanians. They couldn't fight on all fronts simultaneously. Bulgarian forces had to prioritize defending against the Serbs and Greeks. Advancing Romanian troops rode straight into a cholera epidemic. Unsanitary conditions in Bulgarian territory meant disease spread rapidly through the army. Romanian chaplain Dumitru Brumușescu complained bitterly. In the hospital, there are no beds, so the men lie on the floor in their uniforms. They've barely the strength to moan or ask for water. Some are delirious, with spasmodic movements of their arms and hands. Some vomit onto the floor, while others relieve themselves where they lay. The lack of furniture, dishes, linens, medical devices, medicine, and antiseptic rendered the presence of army doctors useless. About 2,700 Romanian soldiers died of cholera in summer 1913. Disease was often more deadly than combat. The Ottomans also saw their opportunity to recover parts of Thrace. They crossed the Catalca line on July 12th. Few Bulgarian troops were left in the area. Most had been sent to fight the Serbs and Greeks. The Bulgarians could offer only token resistance. The Ottomans recaptured the fortress at Edirne without firing a shot on July 23rd. The window into the harem was recovered. Many Bulgarian civilians fled, creating a new wave of refugees. Another cholera outbreak killed 4,000 Ottoman troops. Disease respected no borders and killed soldiers from all armies. As Romanian troops got closer to Sofia and Russia refused to intervene to help Bulgaria, the pro-Russian Bulgarian government resigned. It was replaced by a pro-German government under Vasil Radoslavov. Bulgaria's diplomatic orientation was shifting. This would have consequences in 1914. Bulgaria was now surrounded by enemies. Serbs and Greeks from the west and south, Romanians from the north, Ottomans from the east. The country was being invaded from all sides. The Bulgarian army, which had come so close to taking Constantinople just months earlier, was now fighting for survival. The dream of a greater Bulgaria was collapsing. Bulgaria had no choice but to seek peace, and the terms would not be favorable. Despite being surrounded, Bulgarian forces recovered enough to win some defensive battles. They defeated the Serbs and Montenegrins at Kalimansi. They also launched a successful counterattack against the Greeks at Kresna Gorge. The Greeks asked for an armistice. Sofia ordered a stop to operations. Even a Bulgarian victory couldn't reverse the tide of the war. Surrounded by enemies, exhausted, and with Romanians approaching the capital, Bulgaria had no choice but to seek peace. Peace treaties signed in August and September 1913 ended the Second Balkan War. The map of the Balkans was redrawn again, this time to Bulgaria's severe disadvantage. Romania got southern Dobruja. Serbia got most of Macedonia. Bulgaria kept only a small part of Macedonia. Greece kept Salonika. The Ottomans regained eastern Thrace, including Edirne, despite having lost the First War. Austria, Hungary, and Russia had worked together to prevent Serbian maximalist demands in Macedonia. Both powers wanted to retain some influence with Bulgaria as a counterweight to other Balkan states. This rare cooperation between Vienna and St. Petersburg wouldn't last. The Second Balkan War was over. Bulgaria had gambled and lost catastrophically. From nearly conquering Constantinople, Bulgaria was now diminished and resentful. The fighting and disease were deadly. Cholera swept through multiple armies. Refugees clogged the roads. Atrocities continued on all sides. The human cost was staggering. Bulgaria's bitterness at the outcome would shape its future decisions. Russia had failed to support Bulgaria adequately. The new pro-German government would seek support from the Central Powers instead. When World War I began, Bulgaria would eventually join Germany and Austria-Hungary against the Allies. Serbia had nearly doubled in size and population. It was more powerful, more confident, and more threatening to Austrian interests. Vienna's nightmare, a strong Serbia that could destabilize Austria's South Slav populations, had come true. Greece had secured Salonika and much of its territorial ambitions. Romania had gained territory without fighting in the First War. Montenegro had expanded slightly. The Ottomans had recovered some lost ground. But the real winners and losers would only be determined in the years to come. The Balkan Wars had set the stage for a far greater conflict. The Balkan Wars left a lasting impact on the region and Europe as a whole. Final casualties from both wars: 125,000 Ottoman soldiers dead, 65,000 Bulgarians, 36,000 Serbs, 9,500 Greeks, 3,000 Montenegrins. Tens of thousands more died from disease, especially cholera. After more than 600 years, the Ottoman presence in the Balkans was nearly gone. The empire that once stretched to the gates of Vienna now controlled only a small strip of land around Constantinople. Albania was independent, but its neighbours claimed its territory. The new state was weak, unstable, and contested. Austria and Italy backed Albanian independence to keep Serbia from the Adriatic. But significant Albanian populations lived in Kosovo, which Serbia now controlled. This would cause decades of future conflict. For more than 300,000 Balkan Muslims, the wars meant expulsion from their homes and an uncertain future in Anatolia. They became refugees in their own empire. Many would never return to the lands their families had lived in for centuries. For young Turks like Enver Pasha, who came from the lost Balkan territories, the defeats led to radicalization. Enver's rage was palpable. How could anyone forget the plains, the meadows, watered with the blood of our forefathers? Abandon those places where Turkish raiders had stalled their steeds for a full 400 years, with our mosques, our tombs, our dervish lodges, our bridges, and our castles, to leave them to our slaves, to be driven out of the Balkans to Anatolia. This is beyond a man's endurance. I am prepared to sacrifice gladly the remaining years of my life to take revenge on the Bulgarians, the Greeks, and the Montenegrins. The rage born in the Balkan Wars would fuel the Armenian genocide and the killing of Ottoman Greeks during World War I. The connection was direct. Many of the officers who organized the genocides had fought in the Balkan Wars and witnessed the expulsion of Muslim populations. They would apply the same methods to Christian populations in Anatolia. The events of 1912–13 helped create the conditions for the catastrophe of 1914. Bulgarian resentment at the lack of Russian support caused it to drift closer to Austria-Hungary and Germany. When World War I began, Bulgaria would eventually join the Central Powers. Russia had lost an ally. Tensions between Austria-Hungary and Serbia increased dramatically. Serbia had nearly doubled in size and population. It was more threatening to Austrian interests than ever before. With Serbia as Russia's only remaining reliable Balkan ally, Russia was under more pressure to support Serbia in future conflicts. If Russia abandoned Serbia, it would have no allies in the region. This made Russian backing of Serbia almost automatic. In October 1913, Austria issued an ultimatum to Serbia with German support. The demand: remove troops from northern Albania. Serbia, not wanting to risk war with Austria, complied. But the pattern was established. Austria issues ultimatum. Germany backs Austria. Serbia must decide whether to comply or resist. Russia must decide whether to back Serbia. This exact pattern would repeat in July 1914. Except next time, Serbia would resist. Russia would back Serbia. Germany would back Austria. And no one would back down. The fuse was lit, and it led straight to Sarajevo. 3 wars, 3 warnings, 3 steps toward the abyss. In 1904, Japan shocked the world by defeating Russia. The first time an Asian power had humbled a European empire in the modern era. The war showcased everything about industrial-scale warfare that Europe needed to see. Machine guns dominating battlefields, trenches becoming permanent, artillery killing at unprecedented scale, naval power transformed by modern technology. Military observers from every major power filed detailed reports. They saw the future clearly. And almost all of them learned exactly the wrong lessons. In 1911, Italy invaded Libya. What should have been a quick colonial expedition became a grinding guerrilla war. Modern weapons couldn't guarantee victory when the enemy refused to fight conventional battles. For the first time, aircraft dropped bombs and guided artillery. The future of warfare was born over the Libyan desert. More importantly, the war exposed Ottoman weakness completely. If Italy could defeat the Ottomans, anyone could. The Balkans were watching, and they were getting ideas. In 1912 and 13, the Balkans exploded, not once, but twice. Allies turned on each other. Atrocities became routine. Ethnic cleansing was normalized. Europe mobilized for general war in November 1912 and backed down at the last second. The lesson learned: you could play with fire and not get burned. Until you couldn't. Each war presented warnings that should have been unmistakable. Modern weapons had transformed warfare into mechanized slaughter. Defensive technology, concrete, barbed wire, machine guns, had outpaced offensive capabilities. Quick wars and decisive battles were fantasies. Nationalism, once unleashed, consumed everything in its path. Alliance systems could turn local conflicts into continental catastrophes. By summer 1914, every single piece was in place. The weapons, had been tested. The tactics had been proven. The alliance systems had been stress-tested right up to the breaking point. Nationalist passions had been inflamed to fever pitch. The great powers had practiced mobilizing their armies and threatening war. Atrocities and ethnic violence had been normalized in the Balkans. And everyone had learned to ignore the warnings. On June 28, 1914, Gavrilo Princip fired 2 shots in Sarajevo. Archduke Franz Ferdinand was dead. Austria-Hungary issued an ultimatum to Serbia. Serbia rejected parts of it. Austria declared war. Russia mobilized. Germany declared war on Russia and France. Britain honored its treaty obligations to Belgium. In 6 weeks, all of Europe was at war. The Third Balkan War became the First World War. World War I became World War I. Everything glimpsed in Manchuria, Libya, and the Balkans was about to be applied on a scale beyond imagination. Machine guns, trenches, artillery barrages, poison gas, ethnic violence, genocide, millions dead. The rehearsal was over. The main performance had begun. 50 million people had learned how to die. And the world would never be the same. Our journey through World War I is complete. We've witnessed 3 conflicts that almost no one remembers today, but that taught the world exactly how to fight the deadliest war in history up to that point. In Manchuria, we watched Japanese and Russian armies pioneer industrial warfare. 16,000 men died in a single assault at Port Arthur. Admiral Togo executed the most one-sided naval victory in modern history at Tsushima. Machine guns, trenches, and mass artillery transformed the battlefield into a preview of the Western Front. In Libya, we saw Italy struggle against guerrilla warfare despite overwhelming technological advantages. We watched aircraft drop bombs for the first time in history. We witnessed how colonial wars could destabilize entire regions and embolden enemies of crumbling empires. In the Balkans, we stood amid the chaos as 600 years of Ottoman rule collapsed in weeks. We watched Europe mobilize for general war and back down at the last second. We witnessed atrocities and ethnic cleansing that would be perfected during World War I. Each war presented clear warnings. Modern weapons had made warfare exponentially more deadly. Defensive technology had outpaced offensive capabilities. Quick victories were illusions. Alliance systems could transform local conflicts into continental catastrophes. Nationalist passions, once unleashed, could not be controlled. Military observers from every major power watched these wars closely. They filed detailed reports. They documented the casualties, the tactics, the technologies. The lessons were there for anyone willing to learn. But they didn't learn. Or rather, they learned the wrong lessons. They convinced themselves that superior morale could overcome machine guns. That offensive spirit would break through trenches. That their nation would be different. That war could still be quick, glorious, and decisive. By summer 1914, all the pieces were in place. The weapons, the tactics, the alliances, the nationalist fervour, the willingness to gamble on war. Sarajevo provided the spark, and the world burned. World War I wasn't inevitable. The Great War wasn't predetermined. But choices were made. Warnings were ignored. Opportunities for peace were rejected. And 50 million people paid the price. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the forgotten wars that foreshadowed everything. If you found this valuable, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with anyone interested in history. Check the description for sources and further reading. Remember the past. Understand the present. Prepare for the future. Learn from those who came before. And never repeat their mistakes. This is World War Zero, where 50 million learned how to die. Until next time.